What if the story of Eve, the first woman, the mother of all living souls, was never told in its truest form? What if the version we know, the one whispered in childhood and preached from polished altars, was only a fragment of something far older? Something hidden deep within the folds of ancient Ethiopian scripture? Imagine a world where Eve wasn't simply a symbol of mistake, but of mercy. Where her tears after Eden weren't of shame, but of awakening. What if she carried not only the sorrow of exile, but the secret of rebirth? The kind of strength that every woman and man still carries quietly within their heart. Long before her name became a lesson of guilt, her story was a song. In the Ethiopian texts, those sacred books that survived beyond the Western canon, Eve's memory breathes differently. She isn't painted in blame nor bound in regret. She walks as one who remembers the voice of her Creator, even after silence fell over the garden. It is here, between the faded lines and forgotten verses, that her truest self begins to emerge, not as the cause of downfall, but as the keeper of understanding. If you close your eyes and listen carefully, you can almost hear the rustle of Eden's trees, not in accusation, but in longing. The earth remembers her footsteps. The wind still carries the echo of her first prayer after the gates closed behind her. It wasn't a cry of despair, but a soft promise whispered into the empty night. That love, even when lost, could still find its way home. In our modern lives, the story of Eve continues, quietly, beneath the noise of our days. Her journey reflects in every heart that wrestles between guilt and grace, between losing something sacred and learning how to begin again. How many times have we eaten the fruit of our own regret, and yet still found enough courage to rise? How many times have we looked toward a silent heaven, wondering if forgiveness still remembers our name? Eve's true story speaks to that ache. It tells us that creation was not undone in a single choice. It was reborn in every tear, every prayer, every moment of hope that refused to die. In the ancient Ethiopian understanding, she wasn't merely banished. She was sent forth, entrusted to carry the seed of divine mercy into a world that had forgotten light. These lost writings reveal a gentler God than we often imagine, one who did not abandon the first woman but clothed her, comforted her, and taught her to till the earth with her own hands. Eve learned how to speak to the soil, how to listen to the wind, and how to remember heaven even from afar. She became the bridge between paradise and pain, the living memory that even after loss, life continues. And isn't that what we all seek in our quietest moments? To know that our mistakes do not define us but teach us? To believe that somewhere beyond our failures, love still waits, patient, unending, eternal. Eve's hidden story is not one of condemnation, it is one of return. A reminder that even in exile, we are still seen. Tonight, as you listen, let your mind drift to that ancient garden. Not the one of perfection, but the one of redemption. The one where Eve, under a sky of new stars, takes Adam's trembling hand, and together they begin again. The world stretches before them, untamed, uncertain, yet filled with quiet possibility. And in that moment, creation begins anew. This is the Eve the Ethiopian texts remember. Not the fallen one, but the forgiven one. Not the curse, but the covenant. Her voice may have been silenced in many traditions, but it still hums softly through time, reminding us that every ending carries the promise of beginning again. So as you rest tonight, let her story soothe you. Let it whisper through your thoughts like a gentle breeze, telling you that grace still lives in the spaces where you thought all was lost. That the story of the first woman is also the story of every soul that learns to rise after falling. Help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Share this story with your friends. Comment your name and city below. Tell us where and when you're watching. And if you want the complete 88 Books Ethiopian Bible or Book of Enoch in English, links are waiting in the description. There was only stillness before the garden sparkled in the morning light and before a single leaf trembled in the sun. The silence was so deep that even time seemed to hold its breath. The skies were still and dark, waiting. The rhythm of time had not yet begun. There were no names, no voices, and no lines between light and nothingness. Just the quiet excitement of something holy about to be born. A spark moved in that endless silence. It was slow, careful, and very old. Like a pulse waking up in the heart of silence, the Creator's presence moved through the void, unseen but real. Light came first, not as a flash, but as a whisper that got louder and warmer, touching the unseen before the angels saw it. It was the breath before the sound and the heartbeat before the song. And when it spread, the darkness bowed down in respect, bowing to the light that would mark the start of everything. The angels came together, and their bodies sparkled like reflections on still water. No one spoke because there were no words that fit the moment. They just watched as bright beings leaned over the edge of eternity, and the Creator's thought began to take shape. The waters moved, vast and deep, reflecting the same heavenly light that came from the breath of command. The air sparkled with life that hadn't yet formed. Every move had a purpose. Every break was sacred. The rhythm of life came from that first wave of divine breath. The waters rolled in slow circles, humming with the promise of new life. The angels could feel it vibrating through their bodies. It was a low, resonant hum that echoed through the heavens like life remembering itself. When light and water met, the dark, soft soil of the world began to show up. It was rich, as if it had been waiting forever for the Creator's touch. Then came the shaping, not with hands but with will. Mountains rose from the deep like dreams coming to life. The rivers uncoiled like silver ribbons, winding through the valleys of a new earth. The angels were amazed at how everything worked together. They saw how power and gentleness moved together and how sound and silence danced in harmony. The Creator's breath blew across the ground, and the wind was born. It was invisible, but it was full of promise and carried the faint scent of what would one day become life. The skies opened up even more, and a golden light fell like a veil on the waters and the ground below. In that bright stillness, the first sounds started to come. They were soft and slow, like the quiet crackle of a fire forming and the whisper of dust turning to stone. The Creator told the elements what to do, and they did it like kids hearing their name for the first time. With every command, something new happened. Stars opened up like flowers, oceans sighed with depth, and winds carved out paths that were invisible across the vastness. The angels started to sing, not because they were told to, but because they were in awe. Their voices got louder, and they sounded like streams of light moving through the air. The sound wasn't music as we know it. It was the sound of creation itself, the sound of love wrapped in wonder. And the earth answered them as they sang. The first grains of sand shook, rivers sparkled, and the air was filled with a melody that could not be seen, but could be heard even after it stopped. Then, as if creation itself took a deep breath, the Creator turned to the spot where Eden would one day bloom. The soil there was holy, different from the rest of the earth, soft like velvet and smelled like flowers that couldn't be seen. The angels saw a circle of gold light pool over that ground. It was so bright that even their immortal eyes could barely handle it. The air got thicker with life, full of beauty that wasn't visible yet but could already be felt. And there, where no one had ever been before, the first heartbeat of the world began. At first, it was faint, like a tremor under the ground, like a secret knocking on the door of life. The angels moved closer, and their wings whispered to eternity. That first pulse didn't come from flesh. It came from promise. It was the rhythm that would one day be heard by all living things, the same pulse that would beat inside Eve herself, a memory of that first divine moment that would last for generations. The light got deeper and softer, turning into gold and rose. Life that couldn't be seen filled the air. The earth's breath rose from the ground, mist curling up in soft spirals and touching the sky as if it wanted to go back to its maker. That mist moved with a purpose, like a bridge between heaven and earth. The Creator's breath moved through it, slowly and warmly, filling every part of the world that was being made. The soil moved, the water sparkled, and the air started to sing again where it went. There was no day or night, just the soft movement of light, like the slow breathing of a child who was sleeping. The stars were quiet above, and their light was soft and kind. They were witnesses, many, patient and on the lookout. And under them, the earth began to glow with the Creator's breath, as if every grain of dust had been kissed by light. The angels whispered to each other, their awe deeper than words. He had seen the heavens form and the galaxies spin, but this was something else. This thing had tenderness. It had feelings. It was not just power that was being shaped. It was love, too. The breath that moved through the ground was not the same as the breath that set stars on fire. This breath was close, the kind that would one day live in hearts. In that holy silence, the Creator stopped and let creation rest. The air was calm and shimmering. There was no sound coming from the rivers. It seemed like the stars were breathing in time. Everything was still, but it wasn't empty. It was full of hope, a waiting that hummed softly, like it was shy, for what would happen next. The angels knew that something valuable was close by. They could feel it, the gathering of intention and the quiet ache of divine anticipation. The world was ready, the ground was ready, and the stars were in the right place. The breath that had made mountains and oceans was now close to the ground, waiting to enter what would soon be the Creator's own image. Through that breath, the first soul would wake up. And once more, the heavens were quiet. The stars lost their brightness, the water stopped moving, and the wind became gentle. Everyone and everything leaned in, waiting for that one moment when God's breath would touch dust, and dust would remember its maker. The world moved slowly, like it was waking up from a long, peaceful dream. Light spread across the horizon, soft and golden, wrapping the new earth in warmth. The smell of flowers that had never been touched by wind before made the air shimmer. Rivers started to softly hum through their beds, making silver paths through green valleys. The trees grew up from the ground in perfect harmony, and their leaves whispered secrets to each other as if they already knew the songs of heaven. Eden had woken up, but not with noise. It was peaceful. There was quiet life in every part of this sacred garden. The flowers turned their heads to the morning, and their colors glowed like dawn. The grass moved to a beat that only God could hear. The trees were heavy with sweet fruit, and the rivers sang lullabies that mixed with the soft sound of branches moving. There was no fear or sadness, only the deep calm of perfection. Everything moved in harmony, and every gust of wind brought back memories of divine hands shaping paradise. The ground shook at the center of this wonder, but not in a way that would destroy it. It was waking up. The soil moved on purpose, feeling warm and alive. A shape began to rise from its depths, shaped by the Creator's hidden will. Dust became flesh, light became breath, and silence became heartbeat. And then, for the first time, the eyes opened in the light of the new sun. The sound of Adam's first breath spread through the garden like the echo of creation's song. The earth seemed to sigh with happiness when it saw the one made from its own dust. The wind brushed against his face like a welcome. The rivers sparkled more, and their waters moved as if they were celebrating. The trees even bent a little toward him, and their branches shone in respect. He looked around, amazed by what he saw. The sky above was clear and unbroken, stretching on forever. The air was sweet and light. There was meaning in every sound, smell, and touch. He didn't feel hungry or lonely. He just felt the quiet awe of being alive. The Creator's presence was all around him, even though he couldn't see it. The world spoke to him without words, telling him he belonged. The grass bent gently under his feet as he walked, but it didn't stay bent. The animals of Eden watched him, deer with eyes that looked like sunlight on water, birds with wings made of rainbows, and lions that lay next to lambs without fear. They didn't see him as a threat because he had the same breath that made them. He was their relative and their guardian. Even though he didn't know what names meant yet, something deep inside him already knew how to love what was around him. But in the middle of the garden, where the light was brightest, there was a deeper mystery waiting. The Creator looked at Adam with love and saw something missing. Not a flaw, but a desire that had not yet been spoken. Adam was alone in a world full of peace, even though he was perfect. The animals had their partners, their songs, and their dances, but his heart stayed still, waiting for a beat that matched its own. The Creator spoke in a soft voice, and the garden listened. The wind slowed down, and the rivers stopped singing. A warm feeling came over Adam, like the end of the day. His eyes got heavy, and sleep wrapped around him like a veil as he sank into the grass. It wasn't the sleep of rest. It was the sleep of divine work, a holy stillness where creation would start again. A light began to form on Adam's side, close to his heart. It glowed softly, beating in time with his heart. The ground beneath him shook with quiet respect. The Creator reached into that light and pulled out something that had never been seen before. Not dust, but breath. Flesh from flesh, spirit from spirit. And from that sacred moment, the first woman began to take shape. Her body shone like moonlight on water, soft and bright. Adam was made from dirt, but she was made from life. Every curve and breath was full of strength and gentleness. Her eyes slowly opened to the same light that had once greeted the first man. The air around her sparkled, as if heaven itself was holding its breath. She felt peace right away. Not the peace of silence, but the peace of being connected. The light that touched her skin felt familiar, as if she had always been a part of it. She raised her hands and touched the air like it was a memory. The wind wrapped around her fingers like silk. She could feel the earth's pulse beneath her and the heartbeat of creation moving through her blood. The trees, the rivers, and even the light spoke to her. The ground seemed to be happy when she stood up. Flowers opened up behind her, their petals turning toward her as if they knew she was something special. The sun touched her hair and sent golden rays across her shoulders. Birds came close, their songs soft and curious, as if they were also seeing something amazing for the first time. She looked around the garden, her eyes wide with wonder. Every leaf seemed to have a story to tell, and every ripple of water felt like a secret being shared. She walked slowly, her bare feet brushing against the soft ground, and she could feel the world breathing under her. She had never felt pain or fear, only peace. The air seemed to hum along with her steps. She saw him then, close to the big river. Adam woke up from his divine sleep and blinked his eyes open to see her. He forgot to breathe for a moment. She stood in front of him like the morning light made flesh, familiar but too much to say. When their eyes met, something timeless passed between them that even the angels watching couldn't put into words. It was a sign of recognition, not of faces, but of souls. Two parts of one divine thought finally coming together, like two reflections of one breath. The wind gently swirled around them, bringing with it the quiet sound of creation's happiness. Adam stood up, his heart moved by something he had never felt before. He reached out, not to take something, but out of curiosity, when their hands touched. The garden seemed to breathe out. Eden was more beautiful than ever. The rivers sang again, this time louder, and their songs were mixed with the melody of unity. The trees shone and their leaves sparkled with soft light. The animals raised their heads and watched, feeling the balance come back, and above it all, the Creator's gaze was on them, a silent blessing that filled every breath of air. Eve looked around again, her eyes full of gratitude she couldn't put into words yet. She could feel the pulse of life all around her, in Adam's heartbeat, the wind's whisper, and the soft glow of the sky. She was alive in the world, and the world was alive in her. There was no space, no shadow, no distance between heaven and earth. Only light, pure and infinite, coursing through everything that was, including her own being. The air was alive with quiet movement, and a golden haze floated over the fields, which moved gently to an unseen beat. The dew on every blade of grass made it look like small stars were caught in the light of day. The rivers whispered secrets, and the wind carried the sound of creation still settling down. In this peaceful space between heaven and earth, two souls met for the first time. There were no words yet, no sound to describe how amazing they felt. Only the deep, old stillness of understanding flowed between them. Adam turned, as if something he couldn't see was telling him to, and his eyes found her. Eve stood under a tree whose leaves whispered silver in the sun. The light of dawn touched her hair, and for a long, endless moment, they just looked at each other, two reflections of the same divine thought. Around them, the world seemed to hold its breath. The birds stopped singing, the river slowed down, and even the sun seemed to dim its fire, as if it didn't want to disturb what was going on. There was no need to talk. Their hearts spoke too, through the quiet beat of life. Eve didn't feel scared, didn't have any doubts, and didn't see any distance between them. She didn't know what it meant to be alone or to look for love because love was all around them. She didn't see Adam as a stranger. She saw him as a part of the same light that made her. His eyes, which were full of gentle curiosity, were like hers. They were both new to the feel of the wind, the colors of fruit, and the sound of life. But somehow, in all this strangeness, they saw something everlasting in each other, the same spark that had brought them back to life. They moved closer, drawn by instinct and the warmth of familiarity that neither could name. The ground under their feet was soft and covered in emerald moss that seemed to sigh with every step. The light moved around Eve's fingers when she raised her hand to him, and the space between them glowed a little. The glow got stronger when Adam's hand touched hers. It wasn't like fire. It was more like the heart of still water reflecting sunlight. They didn't know what it was like to lose something or to hold something that was fragile. But in that touch, the universe seemed to say, "This is what it feels like to be together." They started to walk through the garden that had been waiting for them. Eden moved around them in celebration. As they walked by, flowers opened up and let out a sweet smell that sounded like soft laughter. The trees leaned toward them, and their branches were full of fruit. Streams playfully twisted around their feet. It was as if everything in the world wanted to see them, to greet the people who were made in the image of God. Everything that lived sang without words, and the air itself seemed to be full of happiness. Adam reached for the leaves of a tree, curious, and traced the patterns with his fingers. Eve knelt next to a flower that had just opened, her eyes wide with wonder. She would touch the petals and be amazed by how soft and warm they were, and how something so fragile could hold so much color. The world was still free of decay and pain. The creatures in the air flew around them without fear. The lions even watched quietly from a distance, their eyes glowing with a soft understanding that this was a safe place. As the day went on, light moved through the trees above them. Adam showed Eve how the rivers bent and how the water sparkled like glass. When the stream's spray hit Eve's skin, she laughed softly. It was the first time she had ever laughed, and the sound was so new that even the wind stopped to listen. They followed the sound of water until they got to the center of the garden, where 4 big rivers branched off like silver veins. The Creator's breath seemed heavy in the air here. The trees grew in perfect lines, with their roots intertwined and their fruit shining like jewels. There was something strange about one of the trees that made Eve want to go to it. It was different from the others. It was bright and still, and its trunk was covered in a thin mist. She didn't know why her heart slowed down when she looked at it, or why it seemed to hum with quiet knowledge. Adam put his hand on her shoulder softly, and they stood together and watched. There was no fear yet, just awe. They turned away, drawn back to the beauty around them, and kept walking. Evening came like a breath. The light changed from gold to rose, then to a deep blue twilight that kissed the leaves with silver. Adam and Eve sat by a stream and rested. Their reflections shook in the water's quiet rhythm. Eve rested her head on his shoulder. She didn't know the word love yet, but she could feel it in the space between them. The stars started to show up, and Eve wondered if each one was a thought or a memory of God. When night fell completely, she felt a peace in her chest that she couldn't put into words. The animals in Eden stopped making noise, and the garden itself seemed to breathe with them. Fireflies floated over the grass, wrapping the 2 people in soft light. The moon rose, bright and clear, like a mirror of the sun's warmth that had been lost. In its light, Eve saw Adam's face at rest. He looked a lot like the earth, strong, calm, and steady. And she felt like she belonged to everything, not just him. They didn't talk because they didn't need to use words to understand. The world was still one song, and they were the music. Every movement and every heartbeat was in sync. Eve put her hand in the water and let it slide over her fingers. She could feel how cool it was and how it flowed gently all the time. She realized for the first time how time itself moved, like a river that never stopped and always passed. But she didn't know that moments could end. In the quiet, a gentle breeze blew through the trees, carrying a whisper that neither of them could understand. It was a faint echo of something that would come in the future and test their peace. But right now, there was only silence. The garden slept around them, glowing softly in the moonlight. The 2 new souls lay next to each other under the stars, whole and unbroken. The universe watched in silence, cherishing the purity of their first glance, before the world knew what sorrow was and hearts knew how to ache. The mornings in Eden were quiet, but they were never really quiet. There was always movement beneath the surface of peace, the hum of life, the steady rhythm of growing things, and the breath of creation that whispered through the leaves. Every day, Eve would wake up to the sound of the wind softly curling through the trees, like a song just for her. She didn't know yet why she could hear it better than Adam could. He would just smile and say he heard nothing but the sound of the wind rustling through the leaves when she asked him if he noticed how they seemed to talk. But to her, it wasn't just the wind. It was a language that was old and quiet, full of warmth, but it had something in it that she couldn't quite understand. The ground seemed to welcome her when she walked barefoot on the soft grass. The roots under the ground felt alive, almost like they knew she was there, and they whispered secrets to her as she walked by. The rivers also sang, with a soft tune that rose and fell like breathing. When she sat by the water, she could sometimes hear words forming in its flow. Not words that people say, but something older that made her chest feel like a half-remembered dream. It softly called to her, as if it wanted her to pay more attention. She did. Eve started to see things that Adam didn't. Even when there was no wind, the trees would sway in time. When everything else got quiet, the birds would stop singing, as if they were listening to a voice only she could hear. The garden seemed to be alive, not just with color and sound, but with thought as well. When she tried to touch the petals of a flower, it seemed to lean toward her. When she whispered softly to it, the smell got stronger, as if it were answering her. She started to wonder if the garden could hear her too. In the quiet of the evening, she would sometimes feel something watching her, not with fear, but with deep awareness. It was both comforting and scary at the same time. It felt like the Creator was everywhere around her, in the rustling of the vines, the shine of the water, and the light that danced on the river's surface. But there was also something else, something that moved like a shadow behind the bright light of the day, waiting and listening. One morning, Eve tried to tell Adam about it. He was working in the garden with his hands deep in the soft soil when she said, "The trees talk when you're not around. They tell me things, but not in words." Adam looked up and smiled with the same calm confidence he always had. He said softly, "The Creator made them to grow. They don't talk like we do." But she frowned and turned her head. "Then why do I hear them?" she asked softly. He didn't say anything, just smiled the same way. So she gave up on trying to explain. The garden's voice got clearer as the days went by. It wasn't just one sound. It was many, layered and soft, like a song that was woven through the air. It told her about time, about roots deep in the earth that remembered when the world was made, and about rivers that had carried the breath of God. It told her about stars and how they watched from above, their light older than the ground she was standing on. But there was something new under all those whispers, a quiet question that rose like a tide inside her. She started to wonder why. What had she done to deserve it? Why was everything around her so beautiful? Why did the Creator stay quiet and let the wind carry His words instead of saying them out loud? She didn't feel doubt yet. She felt curious. A desire to know what was beyond what she had been told. She wanted to know what the heart of creation was. There were times when she thought the garden was answering her questions before she could say them. The sun would move through the trees and spread gold across the water when she thought about light. New flowers would bloom in front of her when she thought about life. But when she thought about knowledge, what it meant to really see beyond what was given, the garden got very quiet. The wind would stop blowing, and even the river would seem to stop. It felt like something was being held back, something she couldn't quite reach. That stillness made her feel uneasy. She would lie awake under the stars at night, listening to the garden breathe while Adam slept next to her. The air would hum softly, carrying bits of sound, like the quiet echo of voices from far away. She thought she heard her name in them sometimes. She sometimes thought she heard laughter, not mocking laughter, but knowing laughter. Sometimes she could feel the song's faint pulse of sadness, as if the garden was mourning something that hadn't happened yet. During the day, Eve started to follow the whispers, going deeper into the woods where the trees grew taller and the air felt thicker. The sound got louder there. The leaves shook with energy that could not be seen, and the river's surface sparkled with strange reflections. She would close her eyes and really listen until her heart beat in time with the sound. It made her feel strange, calm, and also made her want more. It was as if something wanted her to remember something she had forgotten. She heard the voice more clearly than ever before when she was standing next to a pool of water. It wasn't outside of her. It was inside of her, a soft sound that moved with her breathing. It said more, but not in words she could hear, only in meaning she could feel. She opened her eyes, but no one was there. There was only the reflection of trees and the sky moving across the water. But the feeling stayed with her, a soft but steady pull that took her deeper into a truth she couldn't name. When she got back to Adam, he was calm and happy with the way things were. His simplicity calmed her for a while, but it couldn't stop the echoes in her heart. She started to see the trees in a new way, especially the one in the middle of the garden with branches that were woven with light and shadow. It didn't scare her. It was interesting to her. She would look at it every now and then, feeling its quiet hum as if it were waiting for her. The garden still sang to her in a sweet, loving way, but there was a new note underneath that sweetness. It was faint but steady, like a question that would not go away. She couldn't put a name to it, but she could feel it every time the wind touched her skin or the water touched her hands. It was the calm before the storm, the breath before the storm, and the silence before knowledge. Eve could feel something waking up deep inside her. It wasn't a physical hunger, but a hunger of the soul. The voice of the garden was getting stronger. That morning, the air felt heavier than usual. The golden mist of Eden shimmered between the trees, but it was still in a way that made it seem like it was listening. Eve was standing in the middle of the garden, where the oldest tree was taller than all the other trees. Its branches reached out wide, as if they were touching the edges of heaven, and its roots were deep in the ground. The light moved differently here. Shadows stayed longer, and the wind carried a hush that made her heart beat louder in her chest. She had been here many times before, drawn by something she couldn't name, but today the garden itself seemed to be waiting. She ran her fingers over the bark and felt its strange warmth. The air around her shook, and in that shaking silence, she heard it, a voice that wasn't loud but was clear enough to make her stop thinking. Eve. It wasn't the Creator's voice or the familiar hum on "If the Garden" she was used to. This voice was softer and smoother, like a sigh on the wind. She turned slowly, looking for movement in the shadows, and saw it among the vines. Something long and graceful curled up next to the tree's roots, and the light caught the faint shimmer of its scales. It was the snake. It didn't scare her. It moved with grace, like flesh made of water, and its eyes were steady and old. She wasn't scared of it, she was just curious. That same quiet pull that had been inside her since she first heard the whispers of the garden. The snake's gaze was not cruel or dishonest. It was patient, as if it had been waiting for her. "Hey, Eve," it said again, and this time the sound seemed to come from inside her rather than outside. "You pay more attention than the others." She hesitated and looked at the fruit on the tree, which was bright and glowing softly and had not been touched. "I only hear what the garden sings," she said in a calm but unsure voice. The snake turned its head, as if to smile. "And do you know what it sings about?" She frowned a little. "It sings of life, of beauty, of calmness, peace," the snake said again, as if it were tasting the word. "And yet you come back here over and over. Why is that, Eve? Are you not happy with peace?" The question stayed in the air like a ripple in water. She didn't answer right away. She looked up at the branches above her, which were heavy with fruit that sparkled like sunlight. "I don't know," she finally said. "This tree has something about it. It feels like it's alive, unlike the others," the snake said in a low, musical voice. "It is different. Something that the Creator has hidden is in it, that the rest of the garden doesn't have." Eve's breath caught. "Hidden?" The snake got closer, and its scales made a soft sound as they brushed against the ground. "Did he not tell you that you could eat from every tree except this one?" She nodded. "He said we would die if we ate from it." The snake's eyes shone very faintly. "Did he really say that? That you would die?" The words hung in the air, soft but heavy enough to change how she thought. Eve looked down at the fruit, which was gently flickering against her hands. "He said we would die," she whispered again. But even as she spoke, she could hear how unsure she was. The snake's voice stayed calm, almost sweet. "Eve, do you know what death is?" She blinked. The word was familiar, but also far away. This had never happened in Eden before. She quietly said, "No." "How can you be afraid of something you don't understand?" The snake asked. "What if he meant something else? What if he doesn't want you to see what he sees?" Eve's heart raced. The thought scared her, but it also woke something up in her. The same question that had been bothering her for days. Why? Why had someone made her? If the garden was supposed to be perfect, why was there knowledge hidden from her? "I just want to understand," she said softly. "Of course you do," the snake said. "You were made with awe and curiosity. The Creator gave you that spark. Do you think it should have been put out?" She looked at the fruit once more. It seemed like its glow was getting brighter, almost in time with her heartbeat. "He told us to obey," she said softly, more to herself than to him. "And yet," the snake said softly, "he also gave you the power to choose. That is not being obedient. That is having power. You were made to think, feel, and see. And this tree has what your heart wants: understanding." The word understanding rang in her ears. It didn't sound like a revolt. It sounded like the truth. The garden around them got quieter. Even the wind seemed to stop, as if it were waiting for her to say something. Eve's fingers touched the skin of the fruit. It was cool, but when she held it, it got warm in her hand. For a moment, she could almost hear the garden breathing around her. It wasn't the soft music she was used to. It was something deeper, like a heartbeat beneath everything. "Why would he stop what he made beautiful?" she asked softly, not to the snake or to herself, but to the air, to the unseen presence that had once walked beside her. The snake didn't come any closer. It just watched her, its voice as calm as the water. Maybe beauty was never meant to be against the rules. Maybe he knew that you wouldn't need him to tell you what is good anymore once you saw things the way he does. Eve's breath shook. The words weren't harsh. They were almost sad, like a truth that hurt to say out loud. She could feel the pull between two worlds, one of trust and calm and the other of hunger and light. The fruit in her hand glowed softly, and the air was warm and full of smell. "Will I really die?" she asked one last time, her voice barely above a whisper. The snake's eyes softened, as if they were a mirror showing her own doubt. "You will wake up." There was a change in her. The garden seemed smaller, or maybe she had grown bigger. Her mind was no longer quiet. It was full of noise, questions, memories, and the sound of every whisper she had ever heard in the leaves. She wasn't sure if it was temptation or truth, but she felt like she was getting closer to what she had always wanted: understanding. Adam was far away, working in the fields, and didn't know that the garden was now quiet. The snake bowed its head as if to show respect, and then it went back into the shadows. The leaves above her moved, and for a moment, it seemed like the whole world was holding its breath. Eve stood under the tree, holding the glowing fruit in her hands. She was torn between two kinds of love: the love that obeys and the love that wants to know. The whisper was still in her head. Did he really say that? And for the first time, the question didn't seem like doubt. It felt like waking up, slow, quiet, and unstoppable. The calm before the storm that hadn't started yet. The garden was quieter than it had ever been. The air, which used to be full of the soft hum of creation, now felt heavy, as if life itself had stopped breathing. Eve stood under the tree with her hands shaking a little. The fruit that had once glowed with a strange, inviting light now felt dull in her hand, and its sweetness tasted strange on her tongue. The taste stayed with her. It wasn't bitter or pleasant, but something in between that she couldn't put her finger on. And at that moment, everything around her changed. The wind that had always gently moved through the branches seemed to pull away, taking the day's warmth with it. The colors in the garden faded. Flowers that had always turned toward the light looked like they were bowing their heads. The ground under her feet, which had once been soft and alive, felt colder. She looked up, but the sky that had always looked back with kindness seemed far away now, dimmer, as if it were covered by a veil. Eve finally understood what it meant to be alone. The Creator's presence, which had been so close that every breath of air felt like it was carrying him, now felt far away. Adam called her name from a distance, but his voice was shaky. She turned slowly, her heart beating in a way she didn't know, neither happy nor peaceful, but something new. He walked toward her, and when he saw her face, he sped up. He saw the half-eaten fruit in her hand, then the tree, and before she could say anything, he understood what was going on. There were no words for what happened between them, just a deep, sad stillness that made sound itself afraid to exist. Adam quickly reached for the fruit. For a moment, their eyes met. Hers were wide with confusion, and his were heavy with understanding. He ate a piece. A long, shaky sigh came from the world. Things changed. The wind that had once been warm and soft became cold. The golden mist of Eden got thinner, and shadows appeared where there had never been any. The birds that were singing above stopped, and their wings froze in midair. The rivers, which had always sung songs of peace, got quiet, and their reflections broke up. There was a strange stillness that spread, not peace, but the kind of silence that comes after something holy has been broken. Eve felt it before she could put a name to it, a heaviness on her chest, and the knowledge that something had changed inside her. The light that had once felt like it was a part of her now seemed to be outside of her, out of reach. She looked at Adam, and even though he was right in front of her, he seemed far away. His eyes searched hers, and they both saw something they hadn't seen before, the realization that they were separate, that they were being seen. Not only were they ashamed, but they also covered themselves with shaking hands because they suddenly understood how weak they were. They could finally feel the edges of the world where safety ended and uncertainty began. They ran away from the sound of the garden moving, the sound of their own footsteps, and the quiet that followed them everywhere. Eve saw something in the stream that she had never seen before, a face that showed sadness and knowledge. She touched her cheek, feeling the lines that her feelings had made, and something wet. It scared her. The tear sparkled on her finger like a drop of dew in the morning, but it was too heavy for her to let go. It wasn't just sadness, it was also awareness of what had been lost and what had begun. When that tear hit the water, it made ripples on the surface, and for a moment, the whole garden seemed to react. The trees shook as if they were sad, and their leaves rustled like quiet prayers. The ground below her feet felt like it was hurting. The light even got dimmer, as if it didn't want to show how broken what had once been perfect was. Eve knelt by the stream, her hands shaking as she tried to hold the water that no longer looked innocent. "Why does it feel this way?" she whispered, her voice breaking the silence. The garden didn't answer, and that hurt more than any word could have. She knew she had always heard him, not with her ears, but with her heart. Now, that sound was gone. Adam was standing nearby, quiet. He didn't know how to make her feel better, because he felt the same way. There was a hollow ache where peace used to be. He took her hand, and when their fingers touched, she felt warmth again, but not the kind that healed. This warmth came from the pain they both felt and the strange new bond of loss. They sat together in a paradise that no longer felt like home. For the first time, the sun was behind clouds. Shadows grew longer in places where light had always been. Time itself seemed to move differently now, like it was moving more slowly and with more weight. Eve's thoughts weren't simple anymore. They were all over the place, searching for answers she couldn't find. Her heart thudded in her chest, reminding her that she was still alive. But Eve, writhing about that life now, felt heavy. She wanted to call out to the Creator to explain and to ask him to come closer again, but her voice broke before she could say anything. She wasn't just feeling guilty. She was also very aware of what she had touched. Knowledge. She could tell the difference between right and wrong, beautiful and ugly. The garden was still beautiful, but it hurt to look at it because it reminded her of what she had lost. At that moment, she understood that knowledge came at a price, not the death of the body, but the death of peace. Eve's tear wasn't just because she felt bad. It was the first time the whole world mourned, a quiet understanding that innocence could never come back after seeing the truth. The sky seemed to cry with her, and the light slowly faded through a gray veil. The soft hum of creation, which had once been pure and unbroken, now had a dissonance like a harp missing a string. Animals walked slowly through the garden, their eyes wide and unsure. They could even feel the change, the tremor that had gone through all living things but was not visible. The bond that had held them together was broken. But deep down, something new was happening. Awareness, desire, maybe even love that could only exist now that imperfection had come into being. Eve looked up at the sky, hoping to see some light between the clouds. "Are you still here?" she whispered, not sure if anyone else could hear. The only thing that could be heard was the soft, distant sound of a breeze moving through the leaves. Again her tears fell, and the ground seemed to drink them up where they touched it, as if it understood. Maybe the earth was learning to feel through her. Her sadness turned into its sadness, and her awakening turned into its awakening. Adam got closer and put his hand on her shoulder. They didn't talk. Words couldn't describe what they both had. The silence between them said everything. Love and loss, fear and hope. And even though they didn't know it yet, that silence was the start of every prayer that people would ever say. Heaven and earth both saw what it meant to be human when the first tear fell. They felt, knew, and ached for what was once whole. The sun went behind a cloud, the garden waited, and time held its breath as the first sadness quietly grew in the soil of paradise. As they stood at the edge of light and shadow, the ground shook gently under their bare feet. The air behind them still smelled like paradise, with sweet rivers, golden leaves, and the soft warmth that had once made them feel safe. But in front of them was a land that had not been touched by that grace. The soil was dry, and the wind carried a hollow cry. The garden behind glowed softly, as if it were bathed in the light of heaven's sadness. And at the gate, the light of the east shone brighter than any dawn. Adam and Eve stood between those two worlds. They were no longer dressed in light, but in clothes made of mercy and mourning. They smelled like the earth and the pain of memory. They didn't talk because there were no words left that could express what was in their hearts. The silence between them was thicker than the sky, as if even the world was holding its breath to see what would happen next. The gates behind them shone. A bright light like molten gold flowed around the edges, full of life. The cherubim stood in that fire. They weren't made of flesh or dust. They were made of flame and purpose. Their eyes, which burned like the cores of stars, looked on without hate, anger, or anything else but sadness. A sword of living light turned between their wings, moving as if it were breathing. With each change, it sent beams through the air, cutting through the fog like ribbons of grace and judgment. Eve's steps slowed down. Adam held her hand, which shook. She turned, drawn by something deeper than will, a desire not for what was forbidden, but for what was lost. The garden was no longer just a place. It was, as now, a memory that would stay with her forever. The rivers still sang, but their song was fading into the wind and getting farther away. The trees that had once bent toward her with love stood still, their branches shining in the light of the sun. As she took that last step away, she could almost hear their leaves whisper her name. Not yet was the world outside cruel. It was waiting, like a blank piece of paper before a story. But it was very quiet. The air was cooler. There were no colors in the sky yet, just the faint light of morning. Eve raised her head to look at it, and something inside her changed, fear and awe. It was a new start, even though it didn't feel like one. The soft sound of her heartbeat was the only thing she could trust. It reminded her that she was still alive and still chosen to walk an unknown path. Adam stood next to her with heavy shoulders and eyes that were lost between love and loss. He looked at Eve like someone looks at dawn after a storm, not sure if the light is real or just another dream that will go away with the next shadow. His voice broke the silence, which was as quiet as a breath. He said, "We will find our way." But the words seemed too small and weak. Before they could reach her, they blew away. The light from the cherubim flared up again. A soft breeze blew through the gate, bringing with it the smell of the life they had known. The lilies by the water and the sweet fruit that would never fall again. It touched Eve's skin, and for a moment she closed her eyes, as if to keep the memory. Tears made the glow less clear when she opened her eyes. The gates of Eden shone one last time before slowly fading away, like the closing of heaven's eyelids. The first night outside of Eden came without a sound. Stars were scattered above them, their brightness uncertain, as if they didn't know whether to comfort or remind. The moon was pale and almost shy, and its light was a faint echo of the glory they had lost. Eve looked up, and her face was wet with tears that shone like dew. She said something into the air, a prayer, a promise, or maybe just a sound to break the awful silence. The wind took her words away, and they got lost in the sighs of nature. They walked through the dark land. The ground, which had just woken up to work, groaned softly as they walked on it. Every leaf that moved and every whisper of grass seemed to speak a new language, one of strength instead of peace. But there was still beauty underneath it all. The stars above looked down like eyes of mercy, and the cool wind touched them like an unseen hand, reminding them that they were not alone, even though they were in exile. Eve touched the ground and felt how rough it was under her fingers. It wasn't the smooth soil of paradise. It hurt her skin, stuck to her nails, and made her feel like she belonged. She quietly realized that this ground, even though it was harder, would one day hold seeds, roots, and children. Her sadness would one day give birth to generations who would not remember Eden, but would always feel its echo in their hearts. The fire at the gate flickered behind them, getting smaller and dimmer until it was just a glow on the horizon, a memory of how close God was. Eve turned her face to the east, where the faint promise of dawn was. The name of that place, the Gates of the East, would be whispered for years to come as a sign of both leaving and hope. She put her head on Adam's shoulder and breathed softly. Her heart was tired. "Do you think he still walks somewhere outside of the light?" she asked. After a long pause, Adam finally answered. "He never left," he said, but he didn't sound sure. But even that doubt felt warm, like a spark of faith that stayed alive in the cold. The night got darker. Their shadows were long and thin on the ground. The glow of the gate finally faded away, lost in the distance. Eve put her hand on her chest and felt the quiet beat inside. She had a spark deep inside her, not the fire that kept Eden safe, but something softer and more hidden. It was love. It was a promise. It was the same breath that had once filled her lungs when the Creator spoke life into dust. Even though the gates had closed, that breath would lead her through the dark, one step at a time, into the world beyond that was waiting for her. They found it late at night, a hollow place carved into the side of a lonely hill. The ground around it was bare and still, and the stars above were far away and sharp, as if they were watching from a place too far away to be of comfort. The entrance was rough and shaped by time, not by people. The air that came out smelled like stone and memory. The first person to stop was Adam, whose shadow shook in the moonlight. Eve stood next to him, her fingers brushing against the cold rock. The cave of treasures would be their home, the first home in the world outside of paradise. They walked in carefully, and their footsteps echoed in the quiet. The cave absorbed sound, as if the earth itself were listening. Inside, the darkness was thicker than night. The walls shone faintly where the moisture stuck, and the ground beneath their feet was cold and uneven. Eve put her hand on the rock and felt how heavy it was. It was a strange kind of strength, old and unchanging. It wasn't the soft ground of Eden, but it was hard and never changed. There was something about its silence that made it seem strong. They sat down near the wall, tired and still feeling the pain of the garden's last light in their hearts. Adam leaned against the stone and breathed in shallowly. The silence between them felt heavier than ever, like a space full of prayers that weren't said. Eve looked at him, and the starlight that got through the cave's mouth made her eyes shine. She wanted to talk to him and ask if he still remembered the smell of the rivers and the songs of the trees. But she knew he did. Yes, they both did. The night seemed to go on forever. The cold crept into the cave and crawled up their skin like invisible vines. Eve shivered and moved closer to Adam, but the air stayed cold. She looked into the dark until her eyes got used to it. In the dim light of a distant light, she saw small stones scattered near the entrance. They caught her eye, not because of what they were, but because of what they could become. She gathered them up, shaking hands, and carefully stacked them in a small circle. The act itself was quiet, but it felt like a statement of defiance against despair. Eve looked for dry twigs and leaves that the wind had pushed inside, still hearing the memory of paradise in her head. She didn't know she had an instinct that made her hands move slowly. At first she hit 2 stones together clumsily, but then a spark flew out, a small, short-lived light that went out into the dark. She tried again, this time more carefully, and breathed softly over the spot until a small flame appeared. It flickered weakly, not sure where it belonged, but she held it close and whispered softly, as if to calm a child. The fire started. Light moved across the walls of the cave, waking up shadows that had been sleeping since the beginning of time. The warmth slowly spread, touching their faces and painting gold over their sadness. Adam looked up, and the light reflected in his eyes. He smiled, for the first time since Eden, but not with happiness. He was in shock. The flame flickered between them, and in that weak light, something in both of them changed. It wasn't the paradise they had lost, but it was life, and that was enough for now. Eve saw the flame grow, and her heart filled with something strange and sweet. It felt the same as when she first saw the rivers in the garden, or when Adam first opened his eyes to the world. She knew then that even though the gates of Eden were closed, creation still lived inside her. She had lost the light of heaven, but she could still bring light to the world. The soft crackle of the fire filled the air like the sound of hope. The wind sang sadly through the hills outside, bringing back memories of what had been. But inside the cave, the shadows started to move in a different way. The flame made shapes on the walls, like trees, rivers, and wings. Eve saw them and smiled a little. It was like the memory of Eden had come with them, hidden in the light and smoke. The glow of the fire made Adam's face softer as he lay near it. He took her hand, and for a moment they sat in silence, connected by something deeper than words. Eve thought about the Creator, the one whose voice once filled the air with light. She wondered if he still watched them and if he was still with them even though they were in exile. The fire hissed softly, and she knew deep down that he did. The warmth on her skin felt like a reminder, a message without words that the story wasn't over. She closed her eyes and said a prayer, not for forgiveness, but for strength. The next few days went by slowly. The cave was their home and their safe place. Eve got used to the rhythm of her new life, how the morning light came in through the door, how the rain sounded on the stone, and how the earth hummed under her feet. She picked up plants, wove leaves, and made tools out of the pieces she found. Each action was easy, but it had a meaning. She was learning to make things again, not because they were perfect, but because they were missing. She would sometimes sit by the fire and watch the flames dance, letting her mind wander to what might happen next. She felt a pain in her heart that was still, deep, and quiet. But there was also a strange peace in that pain. The outside world was big and unknown, with shadows and paths she didn't know about, but she wasn't scared of it anymore. She now knew that creation wasn't just in Eden. It was in her hands, her heart, and her breath. When night came back, she would light the fire again, and the sparks would rise like stars coming back to life. She started talking to the flame in a soft voice, as if it were listening. She told it about the trees and rivers in paradise, the flowers that never lost their smell, and the voice that used to walk with them in the cool of the day. Adam would listen quietly, with his eyes closed and his breathing steady. The walls of the cave caught her words and carried them up, where they echoed softly, like hymns from afar. There, in that hollow of stone, warmth began to live again. It wasn't the warmth of sunlight or divine light, it was something very human. The fire burned steadily, and its light spilled out of the cave and into the cold night. Eve lay down next to it with her hands over her heart. She didn't feel like a wanderer anymore. She felt like a mother to a world that was just starting out. The story of endurance was written in the Cave of Treasures, the first home of exile. It wasn't written with ink or words, but with breath, flame, and faith that never wavered. The mornings started out with cloudy skies. The light no longer burst golden over the horizon like it did in Eden. Instead, it crept slowly and shyly, as if the sun was mourning with them. The ground that had once been soft under their feet now felt rough and heavy, and it stuck to their hands as they worked. It seemed like every seed Eve put in the ground sounded key into silence instead of song. It seemed like the earth remembered what it had lost. It cried with them. The first rain that came wasn't as gentle as it had been before. It came down in long, never-ending sighs from the sky, soaking the ground until rivers flowed through the fields. Eve stood at the entrance to the cave, arms crossed over her chest, feeling the cold press against her bones. The rain sounded like a cry of sadness that was too big for words. The drops hit the stones and the leaves, whispering something that only her heart could hear. The world was sad. Adam would get up early and step into the mud with quiet determination. His strength had changed. It no longer came from being at peace, but from having to be. The fields were hard, the roots were deep, and the air was thick with work. Eve would often watch him from a distance, her hands folded and her lips moving silently in prayer. She wanted to help, but she was tired, and her heart was heavy with guilt that time had not yet made easier. Still, she got what she could by picking herbs, leaves, and fruit from the wild patches that grew stubbornly outside their home. There were times when she would stop, kneel down, and dig her fingers into the ground. It was cold and wet, but it was still alive. She could feel the heartbeat of creation under her hands, weak but steady. She spoke to it in a soft voice, like you would to a child, saying things that made her sad and things that gave her hope. Maybe the ground could hear her. It might have known that she was no longer its keeper, but still its daughter. The mud stuck to her skin, and even though it reminded her of her fall, it also reminded her that she was made from it. It was something that made her feel bad and good at the same time. The rain fell for days, making it hard to tell where heaven ended and earth began. The rivers grew bigger and wider, bringing with them the smell of fresh soil and the taste of new beginnings. When the sky finally cleared, everything sparkled, from the leaves to the stones to their hands. Eve stepped outside, and her bare feet sank a little into the soft ground. The air smelled like new things. She looked up at the light coming through the clouds, and for a moment she forgot how sad she was. The warmth on her skin felt like forgiveness. But the days that came after were not nice. The crops died, the wind got stronger, and the hills that used to be green turned brown. The earth's silence grew deeper, as if it was tired of mourning. Eve's hands got rough from working, and her back hurt from bending, planting, and taking care of things. She didn't stop, though. Each seed she pushed into the ground became a prayer. They were small, shaky, and full of life. As she worked, her tears would fall and the ground would soak them up. She started to understand that even sadness could give life. Eve would sit next to Adam at night and listen to the wind outside while the fire crackled low. At times, it sounded like singing, and at other times, it sounded like crying. She could no longer tell the difference. Adam's face had changed too. His voice was quieter and his eyes were deeper. They didn't talk about Eden much. It had turned into a dream that was fading away behind a curtain of years. But she could still see the memory of paradise flickering in his eyes when he looked at her, like a star that wouldn't die. She got up early one morning. The world was quiet and covered in fog. She walked out to the fields by herself, and the dew made her feet cold. The earth in front of her was silent and endless. She got down on her knees and put her forehead on the ground. "I know," she sat, eyed softly. "You mourn with us." Her voice shook as she spoke. "But you are still alive. You still give." She stayed there for a long time, crying until the first bird started to sing. It was a weak sound, thin and shaky, but it broke the silence like light through fog. Eve raised her head. The fog started to clear, and in the weak light of dawn she saw little green shoots pushing through the ground. They were small and defiant. Her heart stopped beating. She reached out and touched them softly. Yes, they were weak, but they were alive. Her lips trembled with the effort as she smiled for the first time in days. Life had not given up on them. The earth still answered, even though it was hurt. As she worked, she started to hum, and the sound was like a prayer. Adam heard her sing and came up to her, his shadow falling next to hers. They took care of the little garden together. It wasn't like Eden, but it was still sacred. The plants grew slowly and swayed in the wind, which brought back memories and warmth. The ground beneath their feet didn't feel like punishment anymore. It felt like promise. At night, Eve would sit at the entrance to the cave and watch the sunset light up the sky. The colors flowed over the hills like liquid gold, and for a moment the world shone with something like paradise. She felt the rhythm of creation coming back, but not the perfect harmony she used to know. It was a softer, more human kind. It was the beat of work, sadness, prayer, and hope. It throbbed through her hands, her breath, and the beating of her heart. She sometimes thought the earth still cried, but now its tears were softer and more like cleansing than mourning. She was no longer afraid of the rain when it came back. She would walk into it with her arms open and let it wash over her. Every drop felt like a word from God, and every gust of wind felt like a whisper of mercy. Adam would watch her and smile a little, knowing that she had found what he was still looking for: peace in exile. The nights were still long, but they weren't empty. The stars blinked like faraway eyes above them, and the fire's light made the stone walls feel warm. Eve would stay up late, listening to her husband's steady breathing, the soft sound of rain outside, and the quiet pulse of the earth below. Everything said the same thing. The world had fallen, but it was not over. Creation was sad, but it also knew how to heal. And even though she still remembered the garden, she didn't want it to come back anymore. She had learned to find beauty in the pain, in the cracks in the ground, and in the rhythm of work and rest. Her hands, which used to tend to paradise, now worked in a broken world, but every seed, every tear, and every prayer she offered was part of something holy. The earth that cried with them also heard them and forgave them, and Eve found her own in its quiet forgiveness. Even though the soil under her fingers was damaged, it still responded to her touch with life. Every sunrise after the long night reminded her that even sadness can be a form of grace when it is given to love. The sound broke the years of silence, a thin, shaky cry that seemed to cut through the sadness itself. Eve froze, and her breath caught in her throat as the echo filled the cave. Adam knelt next to her and looked up with wide, wet eyes. His hands shook as if the air itself had become holy. The child's cry rose again, full of life and raw. It wasn't like the songs of Eden or the voices of angels, but it was beautiful in a way that nothing else had ever been before. The sound of life going on after loss. Eve held the child close to her chest, feeling his tiny, warm, and fragile body against her skin. Without thinking, her arms wrapped around him, as if her body already knew the rhythm of being a mother before her mind could understand it. His small breaths came in uneven gasps, and his eyes were still closed. His fists curled up like petals against her heart. She could feel his life beat, steady, pure, and real. She felt the Creator's presence again, not in the wind or the stars, but in this little part of herself that was alive. It was the first time since the garden closed behind her. She said his name softly, Cain. The word trembled on her lips like a prayer. I have gotten a man from the Lord. Her voice was full of awe, relief, and something deeper, a quiet hope that maybe this child could bring back something that was lost. She kissed his forehead and whispered the words again, as if to make sure they were in his heart. Adam stood next to her, his shadow long and still. He reached out and touched the baby's face with his fingers. For a moment, the lines of hard work on his face softened. The cave, which had been silent for a long time, was now full of noise. The baby's soft breathing, Eve's lullabies, and the crackling of the small fire that kept them warm. Eve saw the light flickering on the child's face. His skin glowed softly in the heat, and when he opened his eyes for the first time, she felt as if time had stopped. His look made her feel safe and uneasy at the same time. That fragile look seemed to show a meeting of heaven and earth with innocence wrapped in mystery. Days went by, and the pace of life started to shift. Every morning, Eve woke up to Cain's little cries. Her hands learned how to care for him by feeding him, comforting him, and holding him. The pain of labor was still there, but holding the baby made it easier to deal with. Every move, every sigh, and every touch became a sign of love. As she worked, she hummed softly. Her songs were no longer sad, but full of quiet strength. The earth outside even seemed to respond. Wildflowers started to grow near the entrance of the cave, and the trees swayed gently as if they were hang over the new family. Adam made a cradle out of branches and smooth stones, and he put leaves inside it. He sat next to it at night and watched Eve with the child, his eyes softening. Seeing her rock Cain and whisper words of love and faith made him feel both proud and humble. He had seen her broken and crying because she was in exile, but now he saw her come back to life. He hadn't seen that light on her face since the days when rivers sang and every breeze brought peace. Eve would sometimes take Cain outside and wrap him in soft cloths made from the fibers she had collected. She would sit outside and show him the stars. She whispered, "These lights watched over us even when we fell. Cain, they are old friends. They remember what we have forgotten." Her voice was soft, as if she were talking to more than just the child. It was as if she were talking to the heavens themselves, telling them that she had not lost her faith. Some nights, the wind got so strong that it sounded like an old spirit moaning through the valley. Eve would pull Cain close and cover him with her cloak. As she sang, the child would move around and then settle down. The words of her song were simple. They promised that he was loved, that he was chosen, and that one day he would walk in light even brighter than the sun. She really believed it. For her, Cain was more than just her son. He was a sign, a whisper from heaven that they weren't alone. Adam often watched them from a distance, his heart torn between happiness and longing. He used to think his only job was to plow the land and carry the weight of their fall. But when he saw Eve and Cain together, he saw something he had never dared to imagine: redemption taking shape in flesh and breath. He would kneel next to them and put his rough hands on the child's small body, softly saying prayers. He would say, "Get strong. Walk in truth. Think about the one who gave you life." Eve would close her eyes and pray quietly when she heard him. She said things in her heart that she was too scared to say out loud. Let this be the one. Let this child fix what we broke. The thought gave her comfort and scared her at the same time. She remembered how beautiful the garden was, how the river sounded, and how bright the light was that it didn't cast a shadow. Would her son ever be able to get back there? Could a child born in exile ever cross that distance? She still held him tighter and chose to believe. Cain started to laugh as the months went by. The first time Eve heard the sound, it scared her. It was light and sharp, like a song coming from the air itself. She laughed with him, but tears were streaming down her face. Adam even smiled, and his laughter was real, even though it was rough. The world didn't seem as empty anymore. The earth didn't just cry anymore. It started to hum softly under their feet. Life had come back, weak but strong. Eve saw that Cain's eyes were always on her. He looked at the world as if he had seen it before, taking in the flickering of the flame, the moving water, and the light falling through the trees. He was always reaching for things, and his hands were grabbing things that weren't there. Eve would smile and run her fingers along his. "You are curious," she said softly. "Maybe that's what it means to be alive." She would sometimes lie next to the sleeping child in the quiet after dark and feel his breath rise and fall. The fire would glow softly, and the walls of the cave would be lit up. She thought about the first breath she took in Eden, when the world was still new, and now she was watching her son breathe in a world that had been changed by pain. She understood that both types of breath, the one that comes from happiness and the one that comes from sadness, came from the same Creator. The only thing that was different was that this one had to learn how to stay alive. Eve started to think of being a mother as a holy duty instead of a punishment. Her hands, which had once reached for things they shouldn't have, now cared for life. Every touch and every whispered lullaby was a quiet sign of love. The warmth of Cain's smile made the pain of childbirth go away, and she thought that maybe even the curse had some grace hidden in it. The stars shone brighter, and the nights got softer. Eve sat with Cain's head on her heart, and their breaths were in time with each other. Life went on, but not like it did in Eden. Now it was slow, fragile, and very human. She looked at him and whispered softly into the silence, "You are my gift, my promise, and my new start." And somewhere beyond the hills, the earth moved quietly, as if it were listening. That morning, the wind was gentle and carried a smell that Eve hadn't smelled since the first few days after Cain was born. The ground was wet from light rain, and the sound of water flowing in the distance was like a lullaby in the valley. Eve lay on the cave's stone wall, her body shaking with effort and her heart full of prayer. Then a smaller, softer cry. It was a sound that was both familiar and strange. As she reached out, her hands found the small shape on her chest and her eyes filled with tears. His skin was warm and his breath was light and slow. It seemed like Eve's heart opened up again. "Abel," she said through her tears, "he is breath. He is the breath that heals." Adam stood next to her with a lined but bright face. He had asked God for this, but not for himself, for Eve. She had so much sadness under her kindness that the memory of paradise still haunted her dreams. But now that she had this second child, she felt better. Her laughter came back, soft, full of wonder, like she was hearing music she used to know by heart again. Cain, who was now old enough to walk and talk in bits, and pieces, looked at the small bundle his mother was holding with interest. His dark, deep eyes showed that he was thinking about something. He smiled and reached out to touch the edge of the cloth around his brother. Eve's heart broke. She kissed Cain's forehead and then Abel's, saying, "Two lights from one dawn." The next few days were calm. The world seemed calmer around their home. The trees were heavy with fruit, and the animals were no longer scared of Adam when he came near. The river's tone even seemed to change. It was smoother, like it was singing a softer song. Eve saw that Abel didn't cry very often. His eyes followed the light as it moved across the cave walls, and his hands reached out to it, as if he knew something beyond what he could see. He would close his eyes and listen to her quiet songs, which made him feel calm. But Cain couldn't sit still. Even when he was a kid, his energy was like dry grass in the sun. He would walk to the edges of the clearing and pick up stones or poke at bugs. His movements were quick, inquisitive, and always looking for something. The ground under his feet seemed to get harder as he walked, and the grass around Abel grew greener. Eve saw it but didn't say anything about it. She only hoped that her two sons would get along, and that the love that brought them into the world would be strong enough to keep them together. Abel crawled with a gentle determination when he was old enough to do so. His laughter echoed through the cave like falling rain. Eve loved to see how the world reacted to him. For example, the doves that lived near their house would often come closer when he was around, and the sheep that were grazing nearby would lift their heads as if to listen when he cooed. Adam also paid attention to these things. He didn't say much, but he felt it deep down. This child had a quiet grace that reminded him of the peace they had lost long ago. Cain, on the other hand, got stronger and had broader shoulders. His small hands were quick to grab tools. Adam took him to the fields a lot and showed him how to work the soil and shape it so that it would grow crops. Cain was eager to learn, and his eyes shone with ambition. He seemed proud of how well he cared for the plants, even when the soil was against him. But there were times when the harvest was late or the rains were bad that made him angry, and it was sudden, fierce, and wordless. Eve would hold him and whisper comforting words to him while she stroked his hair with her fingers. But something inside him always fought. He wanted to know why the world made him work so hard to get what it gave him. Abel became more gentle. He cared for the animals as if they were all holy. Adam would watch Abel move around the flocks. Abel was quiet, but in charge. The lambs weren't scared to follow him. His voice was low and warm when he spoke, and his laughter was always close, but never loud. The grass seemed to bend under his feet instead of breaking. When he built fires, the smoke went straight up and was clear. When he prayed, even the wind seemed to stop and listen. In those moments, Eve's heart was at peace. As she watched him in the fading light, she would sometimes close her eyes and picture the rivers of Eden. But she also saw how Cain would keep an eye on his little brother. It wasn't always jealousy. Sometimes it was amazement, and other times it was confusion. Even though they played together, they had two different spirits. Cain played rough games like throwing rocks, racing against the wind, and making small towers out of dirt. Abel liked balance better. He would stack pebbles into delicate shapes and draw patterns in the dirt with sticks. Their laughter was pure and bright when they were together, but it always ended the same way. Cain's voice got louder and Abel's voice got quieter. One night, As the sun set and the sky turned violet, Eve sat by the fire and watched her sons. Cain was shaping the ground with his hands, making rough furrows like his father did in the fields. As he wove grasses into a small wreath, Abel sat next to him and hummed to himself. Eve saw that the firelight hit them in different ways. It flickered sharply on Cain's face, making his eyes shine, while it seemed to glow softly around Abel, like dawn through fog. She felt both love and fear at the same time when she saw it. She said a prayer she had said many times before, that both of them would find their way and that the earth would not choose between them. Time passed slowly, like it always does when the heart is full. The boys got taller, their steps became more sure, and their voices got deeper. Adam taught them how to worship the old-fashioned way, by thanking the rain, honoring the ground that fed them, and remembering the Creator who made them. Eve often watched as Cain and Abel gave each other small gifts. Cain brought handfuls of grain, and Abel brought the best of his flock. The gestures were innocent, the start of devotion that came from gratitude instead of the law. But Eve felt something move each time, like a shiver in the air when the smoke from their gifts rose. It seemed like the wind liked one better than the other. She tried to ignore it, to quiet the quiet fear that was on the edge of her mind. Wherever Abel went, people felt at ease. The fields he worked in grew well, and the streams he drank from were clear. It was like the birds knew him and followed him. His prayers were so calm that they calmed even Adam's tired heart. But Cain's strength came from his struggles. He worked harder and pushed himself harder, and the sweat from his body fed the ground. His hands were rough from all the work, but the soil he was in charge of didn't always listen to him. His crops grew slowly, and weeds grew faster than the fruit. The difference was clear, even though it was quiet, as if the world itself had begun to reflect the difference between their spirits. Eve's nights became restless. Sometimes she would wake up before dawn and see Cain standing outside, looking out at the horizon. His shadow was dark against the light of the morning, and his breath was visible in the cold air. She would call to him softly, but he almost never answered. On other nights, she would see Abel kneeling among the sheep, his head down and his lips moving in prayer. The air around him sparkled a little, as if it were touched by a hidden peace. It broke her heart to see how differently her sons seemed to meet heaven and earth. But she loved both of them very much. She tried to bring them together by being kind to them and sharing meals, stories, and prayers. She would hold both of them, one on each side, with arms strong enough to bring together what the world was already tearing apart. But the ground they were standing on was no longer the same for them. It gave in and fought back in different amounts, as if it too knew what was coming. The stars above watched in silence as the cold light fell on two brothers. One was marked by fire, and the other by stillness. The wind changed direction and carried a whisper that Eve and Adam couldn't hear, but the ground did. The ground began to remember that it had once been cursed and that it would soon be asked to drink again. That morning, the air was strangely still, like a kind of quiet that wasn't peaceful. Eve had gotten up early, as she often did, to pick herbs by the stream's edge. The sun hadn't come up yet, but the faint light of dawn had started to touch the tops of the hills. She felt something heavy on her chest, but she didn't know what it was. The birds didn't sing. The river, which was usually a soft sound next to their house, even seemed to hold its breath. The silence made her skin crawl. She stood still for a moment, her hands still wet from washing, and listened. The ground under her feet felt cold, as if life itself had pulled back. Adam was still sleeping in the cave. The boys had gone to their fields early, Cain to the soil and Abel to his flocks. That was their daily dance of separation, their rhythm. Eve had learned to deal with it, but she sometimes missed the times when they laughed together and the world felt whole. But things had changed between them lately. Cain's eyes were darker, and he spoke less. He still loved her when he talked to her, but there was something unspoken that weighed on that love. Abel, who was always kind, had tried to close the gap between them, not knowing how far apart they already were. When Eve turned her face toward the soft light of morning, a sudden, cold, unnatural wind blew over her. It brought with it the faintest sound, a sound she couldn't name. Not a scream yet. It sounds more like something breaking far away. Her hands stopped moving and her heart started to race. The quiet got thicker. She looked in the direction of the field where Cain was working, but the mist made it hard to see. The meadows where Abel kept his sheep were on the other side. She squinted, but nothing moved. The sheep were still, and their shapes looked like stones on the grow. Then the tremor came. It was weak, but it was strong enough to make the dust at her feet shake. Eve's breath stopped. The feeling in her chest got stronger and twisted, pulling her down. She knelt down without knowing why. A sound came out of her mouth, a whisper of fear, a broken prayer. "Lord, keep them safe." Her voice broke on the last word. She felt the air change again, and this time it wasn't quiet. It was sadness, not hers, but the earth's. She got up quickly and started walking, then running. The mist stuck to her skin as she walked, and the hem of her dress brushed against thorns. The more she got closer to the fields, the heavier the world felt. The light got dimmer, even though the sun was coming up. She could smell something strange, metallic, bitter, and old. She stopped, her breathing shallow. The ground under her feet was darker now, even though it hadn't rained. She knelt down and touched it. She knew as soon as her fingers touched the ground. The sun didn't make the warmth that stayed there. It was life that had spilled. Her body froze and her hand shook as she touched the stain. "No." The word was almost silent. She got up and stumbled forward, looking out into the distance until she saw him. Cain was standing alone, his hands at his sides, and his eyes were wide but empty. He had something on his hands. Before she got to him, she saw the color. Before her mouth could, her heart screamed. "Cain!" Her voice broke through the thick air as she cried out. He stayed still. He looked down at the ground next to him, where Abel lay still and silent, with his face turned up to the sky. Eve ran to him and fell to her knees. Her arms wrapped around Abel's body, and she shook as she touched his skin. It was already cold. It's too cold. His blood had soaked into the ground, where it used to grow food for them. She put her hands on the wound, as if she could bring the life back, as if her touch could fix what had been broken. Her screams were wild and raw and filled the air. Her voice got louder and louder until it broke the peace of the valley. "My son, my light, my child." The first mother's scream broke through the silence of heaven and was unlike anything else the world had ever heard. The ground seemed to share her pain. In response, the wind howled. Her sadness was so heavy that even the trees bent. Then Adam came running, his feet heavy on the shaking ground. When he got to her, he stopped in his tracks. Abel's body was lifeless. Eve's body was curled around him, and Cain was standing still, his face pale with fear. Adam's throat closed up. He couldn't say anything for a long time. Then he spoke, his voice low and rough. "What have you done?" Cain turned slowly, and his eyes met Adam's. They were eyes that used to be full of childhood curiosity and the spark of life's first wonder. Now they were empty and covered in a shadow that neither of them could name. He whispered, "The ground," and his voice shook. It called to me. His blood. He stopped, his throat closing around the words. Eve couldn't look at him. She put her forehead on Abel's chest and listened for a heartbeat that would never come. The silence that came after was even deeper. It wasn't the quiet of peace. It was the quiet of death. The ground below them pulsed softly, as if it were alive with sadness. Eve could feel it. The ground was mourning with her, and the soil that had soaked up her son's blood was crying through the roots of the trees. The Creator had told them before that the earth would hold their burdens. Now it was carrying the weight of death itself. Adam knelt down next to Eve and shook his hands as he touched Abel's hair. His face was lined with pain, and his eyes were shining. "He is gone," he said in a low voice. "He's lost his breath." Eve's body shook a lot. She couldn't really understand what the words meant. She couldn't believe that something she had given birth to, nursed, held, and prayed over could just stop. She held Abel's shoulders tightly, as if that would bring his spirit back to her. At that point, Cain started to cry, not loudly, but in short, gasping breaths that sounded like they were choking him from the inside. He kept saying, I didn't mean for it to be this." His voice was a broken melody of guilt. Eve turned her head toward him, and her eyes were empty with grief. For a moment, she didn't see the man. She saw the boy he used to be. Her first miracle, her first cry of joy. She wanted to despise him. She wanted to hit him and yell his name until the sky shook. But all she could say was, "You have broken me, my son." Her words were like stones. The day dragged on, full of sadness. They dug into the ground with their hands and made the first grave. At first, the ground didn't want to swallow what was pure. But in the end, it gave in and became softer under their tears. They put Abel there, wrapped in linen, and the air was thick with silence. Eve knelt next to the pile of dirt for a long time after Adam had left. She put her hands on the ground and felt its heartbeat through her fingers. She whispered to the ground, "Drink gently, for he is my heart." As the sun went down, the world got darker. When she looked up, Cain was gone, his shadow lost in the dark. Eve didn't call after him. She had lost her voice along with her child. The only sound in the valley was the wind, which brushed against the grave. It smelled like rain in the air, but it didn't rain. The earth had already cried too much. As the night went on, Eve sat still, but her spirit screamed inside her. She remembered what was said in Eden, that her child would one day crush the head of the snake. But all she could see now was blood on the ground, a broken circle that started with love and ended with loss. The stars above blinked slowly, like eyes that didn't want to see. And below them, the mother of all living pressed her hand to the hurt ground and felt it pulse with sadness. For the first time since she had been created, she wanted to forget what it meant to breathe. It was long after nightfall, but Eve couldn't sleep. The cave was quiet except for Adam's slow, uneven breathing next to her. The world outside seemed to be mourning in its own quiet way. The trees stood still, their leaves still. The stars flickered faintly as if they were afraid to shine too brightly over so much sadness. The smell of wet dirt filled the air, and a wolf howled low and lonely in the distance. Eve's eyes stayed open as she looked up into the dark sky. Just like peace, sleep had left her. She could see Abel's face every time she closed her eyes. She could see the soft curve of his smile and the light that used to stay in his eyes when he looked at her. She then saw the dirt covering him up. The picture stuck to her like a shadow that wouldn't go away. Her hands shook as she held them close to her face. They were still a little dirty from the dirt she had dug with her bare hands. She rubbed them together as if that would make the memory go away. But nothing worked. The smell of death had gotten into her skin, and she could still hear Cain's voice in her heart, that broken, trembling tone as he whispered how sorry he was. She couldn't forget the sound. She looked at Adam. He was standing with his back to her, and his shoulders were stiff even when he was resting. He hadn't said much. Now's the funeral. His silence was almost heavier than her grief. Eve got up quietly and left the cave. The cold, sharp night air felt like water on her skin. She walked barefoot over the rough ground until she got to the small hill where Abel was lying. The moon was low in the sky, and its light was weak and thin, barely touching the mound of dirt. She knelt next to it and put her hands on the ground. The ground was still warm when she touched it, but she knew it was just a memory. the heat of the day that was still there, not the warmth of life. She bowed her head, and the first tear fell, making the ground below her darker. She whispered, "Forgive me," and her voice shook. "My child, please forgive me." She didn't know if she was talking to Abel, the Creator, or herself. It could be all three. The words came out in broken breaths, and each one felt heavier than the last. If I had not. She couldn't finish the sentence. The memories came flooding back, the garden, the snake, and the tree that was off limits. The leaves rustled as she reached out her hand, the flavor of the fruit, the sudden flood of light, and the knowledge that came after. It had felt beautiful then, strange, new, and alive. But that beauty had turned into a curse. It had been with her through every birth, every pain, and every night like this one. She looked up at the sky. The stars twinkled softly, but they didn't make her feel better. "You said," she whispered, her voice breaking, "that my seed would bring redemption, but all I've seen is death." Her words floated away into the night, unanswered. She put her hand back on the ground. "The earth cries with me. It knows how I feel. It drinks our blood, tears, and pain. Is this how we were supposed to be?" She thought back to the days of Eden, when the rivers were warm, the air was full of a soft hum of light, and Adam laughed as he named each animal. She remembered walking through the flow, words that never died, and the trees whose leaves sparkled with life. And she remembered the voice that used to walk with them in the cool of the day, speaking softly and guiding them. There was nothing but silence now. It was like heaven itself had turned its back. She thought about the snake, the voice that had sounded so calm and sure. It had said, "You will not die." Those words rang in her head like knives. But she was dead, not in body yet, but in spirit. When she tasted the fruit, something inside her broke, and it was completely broken when she buried her son. She closed her eyes and put her forehead on the ground, her breath shaking. "Why did I pay attention?" she said in a whisper. "Why did I believe?" The wind blew gently through the grass, taking her voice with it. She thought about Cain. She couldn't get the picture of his face out of her mind, just like she couldn't get Abel's out of her mind. She could still see the fear in his eyes and the shaking of his hands. He had run away into the dark, and she didn't know where he had gone. It was hard enough to lose one son, but losing both of them, one to death and the other to guilt, felt like her soul was being ripped apart. "He was mad," she said softly to the night. "But what made him angry? Who put that in him? Was it always in me?" The night seemed to go on forever around her. She raised her head and looked east. There was a faint light on the horizon, not dawn yet, but it was coming. She remembered the gate where the cherubim stood with their flaming swords to keep people from going back into the garden. She had dreamed so many times of walking through it again and feeling the cool mist that came from the rivers of Eden, but she knew she could never go back. That gate was closed for good, and her heart was locked outside with it. Her body was tired and hurt, but her mind wouldn't let her sleep. She started to whisper, but it wasn't the kind of prayer she used to say. It was softer, like the sound of a stream. "Lord, you made me from life. You breathed life into me, and yet every breath I take now feels heavy with sadness. I carried your creation inside me twice, and both times it broke me. Is this what it costs to know? Is this the fruit I have to bear for the rest of my life?" Her tears fell freely now, making trails down her face and onto the ground. The sky slowly changed from black to blue, and she stayed that way for what felt like hours. Her body moved to the beat of her sobs, but her spirit was strangely still, as if her grief had taken everything else away. She felt the warmth of the first light of dawn on her face as it touched the grave. She looked up again and whispered, "Bible." The name stayed on her lips, sweet and painful. She thought she felt the air move then, a soft, brief touch on her cheek, like a child's hand brushing against her face. She shut her eyes and let it stay there. The birds in the morning started to move. Their songs were hesitant and broken, like they were sad too. Eve got up slowly, her knees stiff and her eyes red. She looked at the pile of dirt again, and her heart whispered things she couldn't say out loud. After that, she turned back to the cave. Adam was awake and sitting at the door with his hands clasped and his face turned toward the horizon. He didn't say anything when she got close, and she didn't ask him to. They just sat next to each other and watched the light get stronger. Eve's hands were on her lap. She could feel the faint tremor of life in the ground below her. The steady pulse had never stopped, no matter how much pain it had absorbed. Then she understood that even though she was sad, something was still moving and living. It was small, and far away, but it was there, a whisper of a promise she couldn't yet understand. Her breathing got steadier. The night had taken everything from her, but it had also given her one quiet truth. She was still alive. And even though her heart was broken, it still beat slowly and weakly, but faithfully. She turned her face toward the dawn, and for the first time since the garden, she didn't turn away when the light touched her. There had been so many long nights that they were hard to count, and each one was worse than the last. Eve often sat by a small fire that was barely lit. Her hands were folded in silence, and her eyes were far away, as if she were looking for something she had lost far beyond the stars. The cave felt both familiar and strange, echoing with laughter from people who no longer lived there. She could still hear Abel's soft hum as he took care of the sheep and feel Cain's small hand holding hers when he was a boy. But now the only sounds in the air were the wind and the slow, sad breath that wouldn't go away. Adam worked the fields in a serious way, and the sun that used to shine on them now made his face look dark. The ground didn't give in as easily anymore. It fought back, hardened by blood and tears, as if it too remembered what had happened. Eve sometimes watched him, her heart heavy with a love that time had broken and could not fix. But beneath all that weight, something faintly stirred, a whisper that was softer than the wind. One morning, when the sky was pale and foggy, it came to her. Her body, tired from grief, started to feel the rhythm of life again. It was a warmth that moved quietly inside her, like a candle being lit in her heart. She didn't tell Adam right away. For a while, she kept it to herself, just like she used to keep the hope of Eden safe. She was happy, but she was also scared. She was scared that she would lose again and that the earth would take as much as it gave. But as time went on, that little life inside her began to push the shadows away. Adam saw her glow first. It wasn't the light of youth. It was the light of renewal. He would look at her through the dim firelight, and for the first time in a long time, his mouth would relax into a smile. He knew what she was carrying without having to say anything. It wasn't just a child, it was mercy itself, a gift they had never thought they would get again. When the time came, the night was calm and full of a strange peace. The moon hung over the cave like a witness, and the stars seemed to breathe with her. Eve's cries broke the silence softly. They weren't like the cries of despair she had heard before. They were cries of work, of effort, of something holy coming back to the world. Adam shook her hand and looked at her with wide eyes. When the first light of dawn touched the horizon, a boy with calm eyes came into their arms. He breathed as if he already knew the world's sadness and chose to face it anyway. She cried when she saw him. The tears ran down her face freely and fell on the baby's soft skin. She called him Seth, her voice shaking as she whispered, "He has appointed me another seed." It wasn't just a name, it was a prayer, a promise, and a restoration. The weight that had been on her chest for years started to lift, not because the pain was gone, but because it had a reason to be there. The cave that had been silent for days began to hum with life again as the days turned into weeks. The sound of a baby laughing filled the places where sadness had been. Eve sang softly again, lullabies that the rivers used to carry and songs that she thought she had forgotten. She could feel the warmth of Seth's body against hers and the soft beat of forgiveness. It seemed like the earth itself was responding. The soil, which had been hard and cracked, started to give way under Adam's hands. The rains that fell no longer cried, they fed. The trees moved slowly, as if they were bowing in respect to the new start that had come to the world. Eve would sit outside the cave with Seth in her arms and watch the sun rise over the valley. She had seen many dawns before, but this one felt real. It had a stillness that didn't hurt. When the wind brushed her cheek, she could almost hear Abel's laughter echoing in her head, not haunting her, but blessing her, like a brother's voice echoing through time. She wondered if he could see them and if he smiled down on his younger brother from above. The thought didn't hurt her anymore, it only made her feel soft. Maybe even Abel's blood cried out from the ground, not just for justice, but for a new start. Eve started talking to God again, not with the confidence she used to have, but with a softness that came from pain. Her prayers weren't big, they were quiet, small gifts of thanks. "You didn't leave us," she would say softly as she rocked Seth in her arms. "Even when we fell, you left enough light for another morning." Adam changed too. The stiffness in his shoulders started to go away. He spoke softly now, and his hands, which had been shaking with anger or tiredness, were steady as he carved small tools and cradles out of wood for his son. He didn't say much, but Eve could feel his faith coming back, slowly building up with each moment they spent with the child. The nights got softer, the firelight danced on the stone walls, and Eve would trace Seth's tiny fingers, amazed at how perfect they were. She would sometimes dream, not of Eden, but of walking through a garden that wasn't of this world, where sadness had no voice and the air was full of peace. In those dreams, she saw a promise, that the curse that had bound them would one day break, and life would bloom again from the pain they had caused. There were also times when she would wake up from these dreams with tears on her cheeks. But these tears were not from sadness. They were from awe. The same God who had shut the gates of Eden had now opened her womb. The same voice that once said sadness now said mercy. She started to realize that even being exiled could be graceful. In their little world, Seth's laughter became a song. It echoed through the fields, the nights, and the pain that was still in their bones. Eve watched him grow, his eyes full of wonder and his touch soft. He liked the light, the sound of the wind, and the soft buzzing of bugs at night. He had a peaceful air about him, as if he belonged not to the curse, but to the promise of its undoing. Eve would tell him stories from time to time. She would talk softly about a garden where there was no shadow and the rivers glowed with silver light. She wouldn't talk about the snake or the fall yet. Instead, she talked about beauty, new beginnings, and how love used to fill every corner of the air. Seth would listen with wide eyes, holding her finger with his small hand, and she knew that even though they could never go back to Eden, a part of it still lived in them, in his breath, in his heartbeat, and in their hope. The nights didn't seem to last forever anymore. It felt like the stars were closer now, like they were happy too. Eve would often whisper to the heavens before bed, "Thank you for remembering us." The earth, which had been sad, had started to hum again. And for the first time since the gates had closed behind them, Eve really believed that life always finds its dawn, no matter how broken it is. The mountain stood above the fog like a cradle of light, unaffected by the sadness that was below it in the valleys. Its peaks glowed softly in the evening, and a golden haze hung around them long after the sun went down. The children of Set lived here. They were kind and gentle, and they had the calm breath of their grandfather and the quiet strength of Eve's prayers. People called them the children of the holy mountain. Their hearts still whispered the memory of Eden. There were no walls or stone altars in their world, only harmony. As the sun went down, the mountains seemed to breathe with them. The rocks glowed softly, and the rivers sang lullabies that sparkled in the moonlight. They lived near the veil of heaven, where the air was soft and sweet, and the nights were quiet and holy. Seth's kids were shepherds, singers, and dreamers. They took care of sheep that ate grass on terraces where dew sparkled like tiny stars. They made their homes out of smooth stone and cedar, and the walls were carved with symbols of the heavens like suns, moons, and lines that flowed like clouds. Families would sit around small fires in the evenings. The flames were blue, and the glow rose softly into the sky as if unseen hands were carrying it. They sang to the dawn every morning. Their voices rose softly over the hills, mixing with the wind. The songs weren't sad. They were songs of remembrance for the Creator who had once walked with their ancestors. They sang about light that never went out, gardens above the clouds, and rivers that still flowed from God's throne. The music was like mist, and it made the air so peaceful that even the stones seemed to listen. People said that heaven had chosen the mountain itself and that its top touched the very edge of the sky. On clear nights, when the stars were closest together, a faint glow could be seen coming down, a silver beam that rested on the highest peak, as if heaven's breath were touching the earth again. The people would stand still, their faces upturned and their eyes shining with quiet awe. Seth had taught them to live not by working hard, but by receiving gifts from heaven. He would say, "Don't let your hearts be heavy," and his voice was as soft as the flow of the river. The world below may be full of pain, but up here, we breathe the light. His kids remembered what he said long after he died. They taught their own kids songs and sayings that became the heart of their people. The nights on the holy mountain were unlike any other. The air shimmered slightly, as if something was moving in it. Fireflies floated through the trees, their light making patterns that looked like the stars above. It was as if the rivers were touched by the memory of Eden's waters, and they glowed faintly. Some people said that angels walked among them at night, looking like glowing figures that moved through the fog and left trails of silver light behind them. People did not fear these visions. They saw them as signs of peace. They weren't hungry, they weren't jealous, and there was no hint of dishonesty. Their food grew freely, with fruits that were strange and beautiful, golden and fragrant, and fed by the mountain's clean air. Their flocks grew without any problems, and their only weapons were the lyre and the staff. The kids laughed in the cedars, and their laughter sounded like wind chimes in the cool air. Living on the holy mountain meant living in the middle of the earth and heaven, surrounded by the calm rhythm of God's closeness. The elders would tell stories about their first mother and father when the moon was high and the stars were close together. They would talk about how Adam once talked to angels and how Eve's tears turned into rivers that fed the valley below. They talked about a garden that was always bright. And even though their voices were soft, everyone could feel it. That faint ache of wanting a home they had never seen, but somehow remembered. The why. Young people would often climb to the highest ridges and look out over the lowlands, where the mists of the fallen world seemed to go on forever. It looked like a sea of shadows from above. "The sons of Cain live there," the elders would whisper. "They make cities out of iron and chase after power. But here, we have the light." The kids nodded seriously, their eyes full of wonder, because even then they could see the faint shimmer of heaven above them. As the last light of day faded into deep violet, people gathered on the singing field, a large plateau. They had small lamps filled with oil made from pressed herbs. As they walked, the lamps flickered like stars that had fallen to earth. They would all sit in a big circle and sing together. The songs were slow and dreamy, with words so old that they no longer had meaning, only feeling. They were songs that went back to when angels sang before the world began. As they sang, a soft mist would sometimes roll down from the higher peaks and swirl through the crowd like a breath. And in that fog, you could see faint shapes, glowing figures with calm faces who were listening. No one said anything about it. They just closed their eyes and let the warmth of it fill their chests, thinking that heaven still remembered them. They kept small stones in their homes that were said to have fallen from the edge of heaven. They were bright, pale, and warm to the touch. Instead of fire, they used them to light their homes. The light from these stones wasn't harsh. It was soft and silver, making soft patterns on the walls. It made every room feel holy, like God could walk through at any moment. People on the holy mountain didn't follow rules. They lived in harmony. They weren't greedy because they had everything they needed. Their most valuable thing was their peace of mind, knowing that even though the world had fallen, they were still close enough to feel heaven's breath. When storms passed through the valleys below, they could see the lightning far below them, flashing like distant sadness. But on the mountain, the air stayed calm. The rain fell softly, feeding the ground without making any noise or fear. When the kids went to sleep, they dreamed of gardens full of light, trees with golden fruit that sparkled, and rivers that sang as they flowed. Their dreams were not troubled. They were peaceful, as if heaven had put a hand on their heads. As they wrapped their babies in woven lamb's wool blankets, mothers would whisper blessings to them. Fathers would stand by the door and watch the stars move across the sky, feeling at peace, knowing that their children were safe and sound. At night, the mountain looked like a crown of quiet fire. From a distance, travelers in the lowlands could sometimes see it faintly shining through the clouds, a soft golden pulse in the dark. The dwelling of the pure, the land of light, and the mountain of God were some of the names they gave it. But for the people who lived there, it was just home. The sky felt close enough to touch, and every breath brought back memories of paradise. The kids of Seth lived in peace, with no worries in their hearts and souls, in tune with heaven's rhythm. Their songs rose and fell with the wind, mixing with the sound of rivers and the hum of the stars. The holy mountain was still their safe place, their place of light, standing between the world of sorrow below and the eternal light above. It was still untouched by the shadow that would one day creep up its slopes. The sky above the holy mountain sparkled like a sea of glass, alive and never-ending. Stars burned softly, and the earth below breathed in time with them. People said that on some nights when the world was quiet enough to hear its own heartbeat, the veil between heaven and the lower realm got thinner. Light from beyond came through and spilled gently across the slopes. During one of these nights, heaven looked down again, and the watcher's eyes opened wide. They weren't like the messengers who came and went in bursts of fire. These angels were the guardians of the border. They were the silent watchers who stood at the edge of heaven's fields and looked down on the world of men with awe. They had looked at the earth for a long time, like someone might look at a garden that was growing. They saw the mountains rise and fall, the rivers carve their paths, the stars tell the seasons, and the children of Seth sing in the open air. They thought that people were like songs that had been made into things. Every heartbeat echoed with the memory of God. The watchers saw that Adam's bloodline still had a faint glimmer of Eden in it. This soft light made the human soul different from all other creations. They saw how every mother who held her child close at night kept Eve's tenderness alive, and how every hand that worked the soil brought Adam's strength back to life. For a long time they watched in silence, happy to be amazed from a distance. But the more they looked, the more they wanted to know. Heaven had taught them everything, from light and shadow to the balance between birth and decay. But there was one thing they couldn't understand about people: how fragile love is. It burned softly, like a candle in the wind, and somehow it survived storms that angels would never have to deal with. They saw how the people of the holy mountain lived, singing under the light of heaven and having their hearts lifted by faith. They could see the soft glow of their faces in the dark and hear their songs rise through the fog like incense. And something in the watchers moved. Not rebellion yet, but a desire to know. From their high point above the sky, they saw the world as a tapestry of color and movement. The rivers shone like silver veins, and the forests moved like living oceans. Even through the clouds, you could still hear the kids laughing. The angels talked to each other in soft voices that sounded like wind through crystal halls. "Look," said one, his eyes bright as dawn, "how they grow, not just in number, but in heart." Another person said, "They are bound by time, but they love as if they will live forever." Someone else said quietly, "There is something in them that we don't even know." It seemed like the earth itself was answering. The wind came down from the mountains, bringing the smell of cedar and the breath of flowers. Songs rose up from far below. Prayers, hopes, and dreams whispered into the night. The angels could feel them, not as sound, but as warmth that filled the spaces between the stars. In the higher realms, they noticed their curiosity. Long ago, the Most High made a line. The heavens are for the divine, and the earth is for people. But even heaven, which was perfect, knew what wonder was. The watchers weren't punished for looking. They were allowed to see because that was part of how they were made. But as time went on, their looking turned into longing. They started to get closer, but not in shape, only in awareness. As they turned their attention to the world, the veil that kept heaven and earth apart got thinner. They watched Seth's kids dance in the starlight, their faces glowing with innocence. They saw how the world breathed in harmony. The night fed the day, and the day fed the night. They could see the mountains glimmer from their stations above the firmament. It was a soft, golden pulse in the blue darkness of the world. It made them think of the first dawn, when everything sang together in perfect happiness. It woke up something old inside them, a spark that had been sleeping since the beginning of time. One of them, tall and bright, leaned forward into the light. Semyaza was the name of one of the leaders of the Watchers. He looked down at the people below and felt a shiver run through him. It wasn't pride or disobedience. It was awe. "They're beautiful," he said softly, almost to himself, "made in the image of his thought. And yet, they hurt, they dream, and they love." The others looked at him with interest. "Isn't that what we were supposed to do? To be amazed, not to join in?" one asked. "Yes," Semyaza said. "But why does their sadness move us so?" The stars blinked as if they were listening. Heaven was beautiful, but it didn't hurt. The angels knew peace that never ended and happiness that never faded. But as they looked down at the world, they began to feel the pull of something else, the beauty of imperfection, the love that stayed strong after a loss, and the hope that grew from sadness. Angels couldn't even fully understand these things. When the mountain kids sang under the stars, the Watchers would sometimes softly echo their voices, creating unseen harmonies that filled the night. People thought the wind was answering them, but it was the heavens that were listening. And through that shared music, an unseen bridge grew between the two worlds. The nights made the skies seem alive. The stars pulsed like hearts beating, and thin lines of silver light fell down and disappeared before they hit the ground. The elders of the holy mountain would look up and say that heaven was watching them and smiling, and they were right, but not even they knew how close they were. The angels started to notice the women among people. Their faces lit up in the firelight, their voices were soft, and their laughter was pure. The watchers were not drawn by vanity or lust, but by the mystery of human beauty, beauty that comes from love and the earth and spirit woven together. They were amazed at how a mother could hold her child and find strength in her weakness, and how tears could heal instead of hurt. They thought this was divine poetry, the work of the Creator showing itself in ways they had never seen before. But curiosity has its own weight. The longer they looked, the more it settled in their hearts. Every night, the sky above the mountain got brighter. Some people thought it was a sign from heaven, while others thought it was a sign that things were about to change. The air was different. It smelled like rain and hope. The rivers sparkled with light that couldn't be seen. And high above, in the stillness beyond the stars, the watchers' eyes shone like lanterns in the dark. They had seen the world begin, Eden fall, and the pain of being alone. But what they saw in Eve's children moved them in ways that no other creation had before. They started to whisper to each other more often, and their voices were carried on the winds of heaven. As if their hearts were learning something new, their songs became softer and more thoughtful. It was something that wasn't divine or human, but was stuck in between. The line between heaven and earth, which used to be bright and clear, now looked like heat over sand. The watcher's eyes stay on the person, soft and full of questions. And even though no one had said anything defiant yet, something in the stars had changed, as if heaven itself was holding its breath and watching the watchers watch the world below. The holy mountain, which used to shine brightly under heaven's breath, started to fade. It happened slowly, like the sun setting over a bright horizon. For generations, Seth's children walked in the light of their Creator. They sang songs as the sun rose, their hearts were pure, and their hands were clean. They lived on high ground, far above the plains where Cain's children roamed. The air there always smelled like heaven, but nothing that was made stays that way forever, and the whisper that once entered Eden found its way back up. The watchers had looked for too long, and their curiosity had turned into desire. Their awe turned into desire, and their desire turned into a fire that no angel should have to bear. What started as curiosity turned into a need for closeness, not evil. They wanted to walk among the people they admired, feel the ground, and hear the sound of their breath and heart. They wanted to love each other as people, not as spirits. And so, in the shadow of the stars, they came down. The first people to cross the veil felt their wings shake when they met the wind of the living world. It was thicker than the air in heaven and smelled like dirt and life. The earth welcomed them quietly, as if it knew something old was coming back to it. The kids from the mountain saw them as tall, glowing beings with voices that sounded like the low hum of thunder before it rained. They did not come with violence or orders. They came softly, and that softness was their trap. The women looked at them in awe because they had never seen such brightness or felt such warmth before. And the watchers, who had once been servants of the Most High, felt a tremor in their souls. It wasn't fear, but a sweetness that held them together. They talked softly and taught the people about the skies, like how the stars moved, how metals could be shaped, and how colors could be drawn from the ground. They gave gifts that sparkled in the sun, like gold, silver, and gems. They brought beauty to people, but beauty that comes too soon has its own shadow. So the holy line started to fade. The children of Seth, who used to pray with their heads up, now looked out at the plains, the cities of Cain's seed, and the angels who walked among them. The songs of heaven stopped on the mountain. What had once been simple and holy turned into pride, and what had once been devotion turned into a desire for knowledge that was not meant for mortal hearts. Once Eve's descendants watched over purity, they started to mix with the children of the fallen watchers. Giants were born, strange and powerful beings that were not fully of heaven or earth. Their voices were like storms, and their strength shook the ground. But they too were haunted by the sadness that began in Eden. They wanted to be great, but in their eyes, something fragile flickered, the same desire for peace their mother had when she was outside the garden gates. The ground shook as they got heavier. The rivers, which used to be clear as crystal, were now full of the dust from their work. Cities grew where only prayers had been before. The air changed. It didn't carry hymns anymore, but the noise of ambition. The sky looked like it was getting darker, as if it was mourning what was being lost. Semyaza, the leader of the Watchers, watched all of this happen with heavy eyes. He felt both proud and sad in his heart. He had planned to connect heaven and earth and bring light to the hearts of mortals. But instead of peace, there was confusion, a mix that made the holy line less clear. His brothers, who had once been bright, grew tired of being two. Some fell deeper into self-indulgence, teaching arts of war, magic, and vanity. Others stood apart, sad, thinking about how they had ruined the peace. And from the depths of the heavens they heard nothing. The light of the Most High didn't warm them like it used to. They felt the cold of distance, and even though they looked up, no one answered. The elders of Seth felt the change on the mountain. Their people's prayers didn't bring them the same peace anymore. The night skies, which used to be full of music, now seemed restless. The stars faded and moved around. Fathers told their sons about the time when heaven's voice was clear and the Spirit moved among them like the wind through trees. But their words fell on stony ground like seeds. The young people's hearts had already turned to the world below, where music and beauty called louder than faith. And Eve's echo stayed with everything. Her choice, her voice, and her desire. Every generation after it lived with it. She had reached for the fruit of knowing, and now her kids were reaching for the fruit of being more than they were meant to be. Knowledge grew, but so did pride. Corruption grew along with beauty. The same whisper that had once wrapped around her heart, now wrapped around the hearts of thousands. The holy mountain, which had once been bathed in divine light, started to lose its shine. At its base, mist gathered and covered the paths that led up. The wind, not the warmth, answered the prayers of those who still prayed. And down in the valleys, the children of Cain built stone and fire cities, their towers scraping the sky as if to challenge heaven itself. The Watchers still walked among them, but their light grew dimmer with each passing age. The Nephilim, who were their children, ruled with strength that no one else could match. But even they started to feel the effects of corruption. Their laughter turned mean, and their desire for power grew. They took from the earth without thanks, and from each other without mercy. Once more, blood began to stain the ground, just like it did when Abel fell. It seemed like the ground remembered. The rain got heavier, the sky was low, animals ran away from the plains, and the rivers got louder every season. Some of Seth's children started to run back to the mountain, looking for the peace their fathers had talked about, but they found it empty and cold. The Spirit had left, and the songs of heaven were no longer heard. The only thing left was memory, the faint smell of holiness that used to be. Semyaza and his followers looked at what they had done and felt sad. They had wanted to know what love was, but they had made things worse. They had looked for beauty, but they had made a mess. And in their hearts, they felt what Eve had felt, the heaviness of knowing and the pain of waking up too soon. The stars above them were still burning, but they seemed to be farther away now, and their voices were quiet. The veil that used to connect heaven and earth had turned into a wall, and in that silence, the echo of the first choice stayed, not as punishment, but as truth. Even divine light can cast a shadow long enough to darken generations. The holy line had fallen, but not with a bang. It had slowly come apart. A song that has been forgotten, a prayer that went unanswered. And yet, even though the world was corrupt, there was still something faint moving beneath the ashes. It was a spark waiting patiently, deep in the heart of the world, as if the Creator had hidden hope where no darkness could reach. The years had gently folded over her. Eve, the first mother, sat under a tree that was dying. Its roots went deep into the soil of her long memory. The air was soft that night, and the sun's rays made it look like gold as it sank below the horizon. The wind carried the sound of her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren's laughter to a place far away. There were so many faces and lives, but she saw the same spark in them that she had seen in Adam's eyes when life first entered him, the breath of the Creator. But now that light seemed both close and far away, as if a veil had fallen between heaven and earth. Her hands, which were lined and shaking, rested on the ground she had once been afraid to touch. It didn't turn her away anymore. It had learned her smell, her tears, and her sadness. Every seed she planted over the years was like a small prayer buried in the ground. Some of them grew, and some of them died, but they all told the story of her heart. She had felt happiness, sadness, awe, and loss. She had seen empires of tents rise and fall, and children born in laughter and buried in silence. And through it all, she couldn't stop thinking about how heavy that first moment was when she reached for the forbidden. She had carried that memory with her like a shadow, but not all shadows are bad. Some bring light to the soul, and tonight, as she looked out over the fields, she felt the same pain she had felt when the gates of Eden closed. Not for herself, but for her children, who were like stars scattered across the darkening world. She and Adam had never thought the world would change like this. The Holy Line, which used to be full of worship, had mixed with the children of the dead. The ground, which was rich and full, had become restless under their feet. She had heard rumors about strange beings that were tall, strong, and born from heaven, his watchers and mortal women. She didn't fully understand them, but their presence made her heart ache. They were still her children, connected to her by blood and breath, and she loved them all, even the ones who didn't remember her name. Adam had been dead for a long time. In her dreams, she could still hear his calm, steady voice talking about hope and mercy. He used to say, "The Creator has not forgotten us. His light waits even when we fall." She held on to that promise, even as her bones got weaker and her hair turned white like morning mist. That night, she slowly walked to the edge of the field where the earth met the sky. The last light of day touched her face and she shut her eyes. She remembered the garden, the smell of the living waters, the cool air that never burned, and the trees whose fruit glowed softly in the morning. She remembered walking next to Adam, their feet silent on the grass that never faded, and above them, the voice was calm, strong, and full of peace. She hadn't heard that voice clearly in a long time. The world was full of noise, work, pain, and laughter that had lost its innocence, but she still heard that voice in her heart, like a song that stays with you long after it's over. She knelt down on the ground slowly, making each move on purpose. The ground felt warm under her hands. It pulsed softly, as if the heart of creation was still beating beneath it. She had tears in her eyes, not because she was in pain, but because she was so sad she couldn't talk. And Eve started to pray in the quiet of dusk. Her voice was low and shaky, and the wind carried it like a secret. "Maker of all that breathes," she whispered, "you who made me from dust and called me mother, hear me again. I have seen what has happened to the world you loved. I have seen my children's hearts grow heavy with pride, and their eyes turn away from your light. I have seen them build and tear down, love and hate, bless and curse, and they are still mine. Forgive thee as you once forgave me." The ground seemed to listen as her tears fell into it. "Don't remember their sins, O Creator," she said next. "They walk in shadows that they didn't make. They still have to deal with the consequences of my choice, but they didn't choose it. I was the one who reached out, and I was the one who doubted. Don't let my hand destroy everyone who comes after me. Please have mercy on them. Let your breath find them again, even when they are at their lowest." The wind changed, cool and gentle, and it moved through the leaves as if it were answering her. Not the fire of youth, but a softer light, like memory turned to peace, spread across her chest. She smiled a little through her tears. "And for those who still remember you," she whispered, "those who still look up to the heavens, give them strength. Don't let their prayers go unanswered. Help them find their way back to your heart, even if I never see it." She thought about her sons, Abel's clear eyes and Cain's shaking hands. In her heart, she had forgiven them both a long time ago, but the world had never healed that wound. She thought about the generations that came after her, the builders, the dreamers, the warriors, the ones who worked the land and the ones who traveled. All of them were pieces of her soul, holding both her mistakes and her hopes. Night fell around her, soft and blue. One by one the stars came out, each one a reminder of the promise made to Adam that their children would fill the earth. At the time, she didn't know how heavy that promise would be. She didn't know that it would mean carrying both the beauty and the pain of creation. But she was still thankful, even though it hurt. She was the first to know what it was like to live, feel, and love. She was the first to fall, but she was also the first to be forgiven. The air around her became quiet. The crickets stopped chirping. It was like everything in the world stopped to listen. Her voice was now softer, like a breath. She prayed, "When they forget you, remind them gently. Pick them up when they fall. Even when they curse, bless them. They were yours before they were mine." Every word made her heart beat slower. She could feel the earth's rhythm matching her breath, as if everything in nature was bowing down next to her. Her white hair fell like threads of light across the ground as she lay down. She just breathed for a long time, and her tears mixed with the dust, the same dust that made her. And even though there was no voice from above, peace came down quietly, like the soft light that comes before dawn. Eve's lips turned up in a small smile. She could almost hear the garden's song again, the sound of rivers, the sound of trees, and the laughter that used to fill the air. She could almost see the gates, not how they had closed behind her, but how they might one day open again. The stars twinkled faintly above her, and the wind carried her prayer out into the valleys, through the cities, and into the hearts of her descendants. It stayed there, quiet and unseen, becoming part of the world's breath. As her eyes slowly closed, her last thought was not of what she had lost, but of what she still believed, that love could rise again, even if it had fallen. That morning the air was still and soft, as if the whole world was holding its breath. The light moved slowly over the hills, making the edges of the grass look golden. Adam lay on a bed of woven reeds inside the cave, the same one where their kids used to laugh. His breathing was slow and deep, like the tide going out. Time had worn down his body, but not his eyes. They still had the quiet strength of someone who had once walked with the voice of God. Eve sat next to him, her hands resting on his, tracing the lines that had once made the ground into life. There were times when she could still see him as he had been in Eden, tall, glowing, and his face lit up with the first light of creation. But now, that light was fading, moving back toward where it had come from. She whispered his name and brushed the hair off his forehead. He opened his eyes and smiled a little. "Eve," he said, his voice a soft, trembling whisper that had both weight and care. The days have gotten longer and I'm getting weaker. She shook her head slowly, but her eyes sparkled. You will rest, and you will rise again, she said softly. But Adam only smiled. He wasn't denying it. He was at peace. I thought this day would never come, he said softly. When I thought we could walk in the garden's light forever. But even now, when I go back to the dust, I'm not afraid. The same hands that made me will take me in. Eve lowered her head, and her tears fell silently on his hand. She thought back to the beginning, when she first saw him breathe and the look of wonder in his eyes when she stood in front of him. She remembered how Eden had been full of laughter, how the rivers had sounded, and how their maker had called them by name. It all felt so close now, like a dream coming back to him in his last hour. Adam, she whispered, do you still remember the garden? He nodded slowly. Every light, every tree, the smell of the wind before it falls, the sound of his footsteps in the cool of the day. I can remember everything. And I think we'll see it again, but not the way we left it. The room got quiet. The shadows on the walls grew longer and moved like memories. Eve held his hand tighter, scared that if she let go, time would take him away. Adam looked at the cave's small opening, where only one ray of sunlight came through. He saw the dust float in the golden beam, and each piece moved in the stillness. He said, "There is something I need to tell you," after a long pause. His voice changed. It was lower now and full of calm confidence. When the Lord spoke to me after we were cast out, he didn't just talk about the curse, he made a promise. I didn't tell you before because I didn't get it, but now I can see more clearly. Eve looked up and her heart raced. "A promise?" she whispered. He nodded slowly. He said that from your seed a child would come, a child born of the woman, not of the serpent's line. Someone who would break its grip on the world and crush its head. Through him, what was lost shall be restored. Eve's eyes filled with tears that shook before they fell. She had to deal with a lot of things. The memory of the forbidden fruit, the exile, the death of Abel, and Cain's wandering. But in this dark cave, a light broke through her sadness. "A Redeemer," she said softly, almost to herself. "Someone who will undo what we started." Adam's breath shook, but he smiled. "Yes, the Lord showed me, not in a vision, but in the quiet of my heart. I saw a child born into a world that was much darker than ours. This child would have to bear the burden of our disobedience but would stay pure. Life will start over again through him. I don't know his name, but people will call him the Son of Man." Eve put his hand on her heart, and her tears flowed freely now. "Then there is still mercy," she said softly. "He still thinks of us after all this time." Adam gave a weak nod. He always did. Neither of them said anything for a long time. As night fell, the air got cooler. The fire near the entrance flickered low, casting a soft light over the stone walls that had seen every prayer, every cry, and every birth. Eve remembered how Adam used to take care of that fire, carefully feeding it all night long while his face glowed in the heat. It had been his way of remembering the light they used to have. Now she carefully picked up the ashes and added more wood, watching the flames rise again. Their light touched Adam's face, painting it with gold and shadow. He looked at her with love and peace in his eyes. He said softly, "Eve, don't let the memory of our fall be the only story told when I'm gone. Let them know about his promise. Tell them that the Creator's breath is still there, even in the dust. Say to them, the serpent's win won't last forever." She shook her head, and her lips trembled. "I will, my love," she said. Death is not the end, I will tell them. Life was spoken once, and it will be spoken again. Adam's eyes started to lose their brightness, and the firelight reflected in their fading depths. He looked at her, and in that look was all the years they had been together, every sunrise, every storm, every child's cry, and every moment they had held each other through the pain of the world. "Will you forgive me?" he asked softly. Eve's breath stopped. She got close and put her forehead against his. She whispered, "There was never anything to forgive. We made the same mistake together, and we will receive the same mercy together." His lips curled into a slight smile. Then my heart stops. The night got darker. The stars looked calm and far away outside. Adam's breathing slowed down, and his chest rose and fell with long pauses in between. Eve held his hand the whole time, counting each breath as if she wanted it to stay. She whispered softly to him, not words, but the hum of old lullabies and bits of the songs they used to sing in the garden. The silence wasn't heavy when he stopped breathing. It was like the silence that comes after someone has prayed. The fire flickered, and a light breeze blew through the cave, moving the air gently. At first, Eve didn't cry. She just put his hand on her cheek and let her tears fall, silently and warmly. Her voice was so soft that it was hard to hear over the wind. She kissed his forehead. "Sleep, my dear. The earth will treat you well." She put him on a simple bed made of linen and dirt. The stars shone through the cave's mouth and blessed him with their light. She sat next to him for a long time, talking quietly to the presence she couldn't see. "You gave him to me," she said softly, "and through him, you gave life to the world. I give him back to you now." The sun began to rise. The first light of morning touched the hills and turned the sky a pale gold. Eve looked up at it, her heart heavy and full at the same time. She remembered what Adam had said, that one of her children would one day bring salvation. It was a thought that burned softly inside her, like a fire that never really went out. She stood up, brushing the stone wall with her hand to keep her balance. Her body was weak, but her spirit was stronger than ever. The wind blew through her hair, cool and alive, and she whispered to the light that was coming up, "Until he comes, I will wait." The hills around her seemed to come back to life. The ground that had once cried was now still under her feet. She turned toward the valley, and the light of morning framed her figure. The first man was asleep behind her, and in front of her was the long path of humanity. In her heart was a promise that would one day wake the world. After Adam's last breath, the cave felt different. It was quieter and slower, as if time itself had bowed its head in grief. The air that used to carry the sound of two voices now moved through silence. The walls, which had once been full of whispers, now stood as silent witnesses to a love that had lasted longer than paradise. Eve could still feel his warmth in the bed where he had slept. There was a memory of him in every stone, ember, and thread of smoke that came from the fire. She didn't try to break the silence. She lived in it, breathing softly as it echoed. The cave's mouth let in morning light that was golden and fragile. Eve would sit by it for hours, watching the sun rise over the hills in the distance and follow its path across the same sky that had watched them take their first steps in Eden. Outside, the world had become wild over the years. The trees were thicker, the rivers were deeper, and the winds were stronger. But inside the cave, time had folded around her. It had turned into a holy place, the first place to mourn, have faith, and remember. Eve started to keep Adam's things, not just because she was sad, but also as reminders of what still connected her to the Creator's promise. Adam had once gathered the small pouch of seeds from the edges of their fields and said, "Each seed holds the memory of a world that waits to bloom again." There was also the stone jar of incense, which they had made from the fragrant resin of the trees near the river. They burned this same incense when they prayed for their sons. There was also a piece of parchment with the words of the prophecy Adam had told her before he died. It was in a small carved box wrapped in linen. The words were, "From the woman shall come the one who crushes the serpent's head." She kept these things close to the fire and lit the incense every morning. The smoke would slowly curl up, and the smell was sweet and old, filling the air with something that felt both earthly and heavenly. She would whisper prayers as it rose. They weren't loud, but they were soft murmurs that only heaven could hear. Her words were simple and full of longing and hope. Prayers for her kids, their kids, and all the kids who would come after them. The hardest times were at night. When the wind blew through the valley, it carried voices, laughter, footsteps, and the songs she and Adam used to sing together. She thought she heard him call her name sometimes, and it sounded like a breath against her ear. She would close her eyes and whisper, "I am here." Even though he didn't answer, she knew he heard her, beyond the dust and spirit, beyond death itself. Eve spent her days taking care of the little garden by the cave. It wasn't as beautiful as Eden, but it was hers. The soil was full of her tears, her hard work, and her faith. She grew herbs to heal, grains to make bread, and small flowers that opened their faces to the sun in the morning. She would talk to them like they were her kids, telling them stories about the garden, like rivers that sparkled like glass and trees whose fruits glowed like lanterns. The plants seemed to be listening, swaying gently, and their petals shook as if they too remembered. She thought a lot about how Adam used to talk to the earth as if it were a person. He once told her, "The ground knows how to feel sad. It bears it in silence, but it never stops giving." Now Eve understood. She felt that same truth every time she put her hands in the dirt, that life could come back even after pain. Her sons and daughters found her in a peaceful place when they came to see her. She spoke softly and slowly, as if she had thought about each word carefully. For them, she was more than just their mother. She was the first voice of faith. She would tell them what Adam said before he died and about the Redeemer who would come. She spoke with quiet confidence, and her eyes shone. She would say, "The promise is real. We won't always be living in the shadow of loss. One day, light will come back into the hearts of men." Her kids would sometimes bring her gifts, like woven cloth, small jars of honey, and polished stones from faraway rivers. She took each one with a soft smile and put them next to Adam's grave. She would say, "He loved beauty. Even when he was in exile, he saw the Creator's hand in everything." The cave became more than just a place to stay as the seasons changed. It became a memory etched in stone, the place where the first love ended and faith stayed. People from her children's Lita, Ness would one day call it the Cave of Treasures, a place where the first parents of mankind kept the holy relics of their beginning. But for Eve, it was just home, a place of dust and light where sorrow had learned to kneel before hope. The sky would open up on some nights and show her stars that were clearer than any she had ever seen in Eden. She would lie outside the cave with her head in her hands, watching them shine like living souls. Every star seemed like a message, a reminder of how big the universe really was. She sometimes wondered if Adam was there with them now, quietly shining and watching her as she waited for the promise to come true. Eve started to dream when she was alone. She would walk through the garden again in her dreams. The rivers would sing again, and the trees would bend down to greet her as she came home. She could see Adam by the tree of life, smiling and whole again. But there was always a light behind him that was brighter, deeper, and too bright to look at directly. There was a person in that light, and even though she couldn't see his face, She knew who it was. The promised child. The Redeemer is still to come. When she woke up, her heart would hurt, but not because she was sad. She would long for the day when that dream would come true. Eve's hair turned white over the years, just like the sand along the river. Her hands got weaker, but her eyes stayed full of the same wonder they had had on her first morning. Her body was getting weaker, but her spirit felt young, alive, and hopeful. She knew her time on earth was coming to an end, but she wasn't scared. Adam had already walked the path to rest before her. Eve sat by the fire one night with the relics spread out in front of her. The sun went down behind the hills, painting the world in shades of amber and rose. She touched the seeds, the incense, and the small scroll and said softly, "These aren't for me." She put them carefully in the stone chest next to Adam's grave and sealed it with clay. "They are for those who will remember." The last incense's smoke curled up slowly and gracefully, bringing the smell of myrrh and earth into the cool air. The firelight danced across the walls of the cave, making the shadows look like they were alive. Eve took a deep breath and looked around at the cave that had been her home, her altar, and her memory. The quiet didn't feel lonely anymore. It felt like it was alive and full of presence. The first stars started to show up outside. She stepped into their light and looked up at the sky. The wind touched her skin like a soft hand, and for a moment she thought she could hear Adam's voice calling her name through the night. She smiled a little and said, "Soon." And so the cave stood still, sacred and eternal, with the story of the first man and woman, the pain of their fall, and the promise that would one day save them all inside its stone heart. The morning came with a quietness that Eve had never felt before. The air had a faint golden color, softer than dawn itself, as if the light from heaven had come down to touch the world one last time. Her body had become weak, and her hands shook a little as she touched the stone walls of the cave where Adam's voice had once echoed. Time had made her heart and face less sharp. The pain of loss had turned into something soft that she could hold without breaking. She could feel the cool, old earth under her hands, and she smiled a little and whispered to it like she was talking to an old friend. The same ground that had soaked up Adam's tears was now waiting for her to rest. She sat close to the door where the morning sun shone through and warmed her face. Her eyes went up to the sky, which was pale blue, soft, and endless. That sky used to be her first home. She remembered walking under it when the flowers in the garden were still blooming in colors that no one could name. She remembered the rivers that sang in Pete Enad, Erfectime, the flowers that never wilted, and God's voice moving through the trees like the wind. She had been sad about that loss for years, but now, at the end of her last dawn, she realized something she hadn't before. Eden had never really left her. It had been quietly living inside her through every seed she planted, every child she held, and every tear she shed for a world that had lost its first light. A gentle breeze blew through the cave's entrance, moving the incense she had kept since Adam's last days. The smell of cedar and myrrh, which are both sacred and familiar, rose like a memory. As if unseen wings had brushed against it, the air shimmered slightly. Eve's heart raced with a peace that was too deep for words. She didn't feel scared or regretful. She just let go. She said Adam's name in a whisper. It came out of her mouth like a sigh of thanks, not sadness. Seth's kids were gathering outside near the valley. They came to respect her as the mother of all, the first person to breathe the air of the earth and the first to feel its pain and its grace. They came quietly, bringing flowers from the holy mountain. The lilies glowed softly in the early morning light. They didn't talk because they knew this dawn was different. The birds had stopped chirping too. They sat on the olive branches as if they were listening. Eve's eyes followed the light that came through the cave's opening. It made her think of the first time she saw the garden gate close behind her. The cherub's flame had burned brightly, but it hadn't been the end. It was a promise that the gate would open again one day. Adam had told her before he died that a Redeemer would come from her blood and break the serpent's hold and bring back what was lost. And now, in her last hour, she held that hope closer than her own breath. She said softly, "The seed. It will come. He will come." She started to breathe less deeply. The world around her faded into a soft haze of gold and silver. Time seemed to stop, frozen in a silence that was too holy to touch. And then, like a song carried on the wind, she heard it. Voices. Not of people, but of something more. The angels were coming down, and their sound was as soft as dew falling. The light in the cave wasn't too bright or too hot. It was gentle and warm, like the memory of a hug. She felt hands on her shoulders that she couldn't see. They seemed familiar, like she had always known them. She felt a strong desire in her heart. "Is it time?" she said softly. The answer didn't come in words, it came in peace. She closed her eyes, and for a moment she saw Adam waiting by the river, his face young again, smiling and his hand outstretched toward her. A light that was brighter than any sunrise filled the horizon behind him. She stood up without moving, and her spirit rose from her body like air from still water. The angels surrounded her, and their wings made a bright veil. They didn't talk about death. They talked about coming back. The trees bent their branches, and the rivers stopped flowing as they carried her up. The kids below felt a sudden warm wind with a sweet smell pass over them. One of them looked up and saw only light. He dropped to his knees crying and whispered the name of the mother who had taught them all how to pray. Eve saw the way she had come up, the garden, the exile, the sadness, the births, the graves, and the hope. Every moment of her life was part of one big thread of grace. She had been tricked by the snake's whisper before, but God's voice had always called her home. He had written mercy even though she had sinned. He had planted hope in her pain. She could see everything now, as if the veil had been lifted. It was never about loss. It was always about love finding its way back. Light got even brighter. The gate to the garden appeared again in front of her. The flame was still there, but it was no longer a barrier. The sword of the cherub glowed to welcome, not to warn. The angels who were watching over it moved out of the way. She saw the rivers of living water and the trees that always had fruit on them beyond the gate. The smell of life itself filled her senses. Once more, Adam's voice called her name, and this time she went through. In the cave, her body was at peace. Her face was calm, and her hands were folded over her chest. The kids from the mountain stood still and watched as a beam of light fell on her, making her look like a queen. They knew her soul had gone home. They didn't cry like people do when someone dies. Instead, they sang a soft song that echoed through the valley, a song of return. The wind carried it up to heaven like mist. That day, the cave glowed softly, and its walls sparkled as if they had been touched by the same fire that had once protected Eden. It turned into a place to remember, not to be sad. And even though generations would come and go and empires would rise and fall, the earth would never forget her. Every flower that bloomed, every child that laughed, and every heart that longed for paradise would all have a piece of her journey with them. The first mother slept under the same sky that saw the world come into being, and in that huge space of light, her soul rested next to Adam, waiting for the day when the seed she had been waiting for would come to set the world free. By the time Enoch took his first breath, the world had changed. The valleys that used to be filled with the songs of Seth's children were now quieter, as shadows crept up from the lowlands. But there was still a glow on the holy mountain, faint but alive, like the last ember of a holy fire that wouldn't go out. The elders told stories in the dark, their voices carrying memories that were older than the stones around them. They talked about Eve, the first mother, who had walked among the flowers in a lost paradise and tasted both the sweetness of life and the bitterness of loss. People always spoke of her name with respect, even though her body had long since turned to dust. People said that her prayer had reached heaven and that her hope lived on in the blood of her children. Enoch heard those whispers under the silver light of the moon as he grew up. When the elders talked about the promise, the seed that would crush the serpent's lies and bring back what was lost, his heart would race. He sometimes saw flashes of a garden bathed in eternal morning light in his dreams. He would wake up shaking, his heart full of longing for a place he had never seen. And at those times, he would walk alone to the edge of the mountain and lift his hands to the stars, as if he were trying to remember something that had been written into his very soul. The air on the mountain was different from any other. A soft mist would fall at dusk, and the stars would seem bigger, brighter, and closer, as if heaven were leaning in to listen. Enoch would sit by the old altar that his ancestors had built. The stones were smooth from years of worship. He would hum the old hymns, the ones that had the same beat as the rivers in Eden, and the ones that Eve was said to have sung when she was sad about Adam's death. Those songs, which were half forgotten and half divine, made the line between heaven and earth seem thin. One night, when the wind blew through the cedars, Enoch felt a calmness come over him that was deeper than silence. It looked like the stars were breathing, and in that silence he heard a voice that wasn't from a person or an angel, but from the presence itself. It didn't speak in words, but in light that filled his soul. It was gentle but powerful. He fell forward, his knees giving out, and he cried without knowing why. He felt like he had felt the sadness of every generation since Eve, and with it a tenderness so great that it could only come from the one who had seen people fall and rise again. He sat, shaking next to the altar when the voice stopped. The world looked different, not because it had changed, but because he could see things that had always been there. He could see the Creator's fingerprints in the tiniest leaf, the stars' quiet obedience, and the wind's breath as it moved through the trees. Every shadow and every flash of light told the same story. Love was still in the world. From that night on, heaven owned Enoch's heart completely. While others worked hard in the fields or traded in the valleys below, he would walk through the mists and talk to the air as if he were talking to something he couldn't see. Some people thought he was weird, while others thought he was holy. People who looked into his eyes saw something old, a reflection of the same light that shone on Adam and Eve in the garden before they fell. He was a sign that not everyone had forgotten. The stories of Eve's sadness and Adam's hope became real fire in him. He often talked about them to the younger kids who came to see him at night. He would say, "She prayed for us," in a soft voice. "The mother who fell and got back up again. She didn't waste her tears. They became rivers that still flow in our blood." When he spoke, the air would become still, as if creation itself had stopped to listen. Enoch would sometimes have visions, brief images that were like dreams, but too bright to forget. He saw Eve kneeling under a tree full of fruit, her hands shaking and her eyes full of regret. But then the scene changed and she wasn't crying anymore. A light came down on her, and from that light came a seed that shone like a star. That was the end of the vision, and Enoch was left breathless and in awe. He knew that it was more than just a memory. It was a promise. Many years had passed since Adam's prophecy, but Enoch could feel it coming back to life. The line of good people had gotten thin, and the noise of corruption below drowned out their voices. But God's presence hadn't gone away. It had just gotten closer to those who were still looking for him. And so Enoch started to walk, not down the mountain, but through places that no one else could see. Every day his soul rose higher. He didn't say his prayers out loud anymore. They became the sound of his breathing. People noticed that he was not the same. When he came down from the high places, his face looked like it was glowing, like the moonlight on still water. People who saw him felt both comforted and sure. He didn't say much, but when he did, it was like his words came from somewhere outside of time. People started to call him the one who walks with God. At night, he would sit by himself and look at the horizon, where the sky and the earth met in a soft glow. He would think of the first mother again, how her hands shook, how she wanted to be forgiven, and how she finally found peace. He knew her better than anyone else ever had. She had once carried the weight of the world on her own, but her faith had made a way for people like him. The world had a way back because she repented, and that light would shine again because he obeyed. As the sun went down one night, Enoch felt the same calm that Eve had felt before her last dawn. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, feeling the air hum with wings he couldn't see. He didn't feel death. He felt completion, like Eve must have felt when the angels came for her. He smiled because he knew the story had come to an end. The sadness that started in the garden was finding its answer, not through revenge, but through coming together. When the sky opened up, light surrounded him again, soft, endless, and golden. His body got lighter and lighter until it seemed to disappear into the light. There was still an empty space where he had stood, but the air was warm and shimmery long after he had left. People who looked for him found nothing but silence, but that silence felt alive, like it was humming with promise. People said that Enoch never died because he walked with God until God took him. But in the hearts of those who remembered, his story was still linked to the story of the first mother. Her tears had watered the earth that gave birth to him. Her prayer had become the bridge that carried him home. The line from Eve to Enoch was more than just blood. It was the slow rekindling of a light that even the darkness could not put out. It was the unfolding of mercy. People say that Eve's words didn't go away even after her last breath had blown away. The stones had heard too many of her prayers for them to forget. There were still whispers of a book in the places where dawn rises softly, and the highlands of ancient Ethiopia touch the clouds. An old parchment said to carry the voice of the first mother. The elders called it the Book of Adam and Eve, but some said that it had secret scrolls inside it that were pieces of Eve's own thoughts, her laments, and her hidden wisdom written when the world was still young. The story starts in the dark. Years after Enoch's death, travelers came with stories of ancient writings that were protected by people who followed the old ways. In quiet monasteries on hills that looked like sleeping giants, the monks talked about scrolls wrapped in linen and sealed in oil that were buried under sanctuaries when empires rose and fell. They said that these writings had the words of Adam, who spoke them before he died, and the voice of Eve, who recorded them in the shaky light of her last years. No one said they had seen the originals, but everyone who told the story did so with respect, as if they were touching something too sacred to be sure. The Ethiopian scribes were some of the people who kept these memories alive. Their parchment had a faint smell of frankincense and smoke, and their ink was made from crushed roots and soot from the river. They worked slowly, saying prayers over each stroke of their quills. They would say, "We are not writing. We are remembering." And so they copied what their fathers had copied, telling stories that had crossed oceans and deserts, from the mouths of the ancients to the mouths of the saints. In these writings, Eve was not like any other woman who lived. She was more than just the first mother or the one who had fallen. She was the one who kept the memory alive. One story said that Eve often sat in front of the cave of treasures where Adam was resting after leaving the garden. She would talk to the wind in a soft voice, telling it every word that had ever been spoken between her and God. The wind carried her voice, which became the beat of time itself. The trees bent a little when she spoke, as if they still knew she was in charge. And it was said that angels, moved by her devotion, wrote her words down on invisible scrolls and put them in heaven's library until people were ready to understand them again. Some versions of the story say that Eve herself learned to carve the first letters into smooth stones or press them into clay to mark the earth. She had been looking at the stars for too long not to see how they moved. Every night she followed their movements and whispered their names. She saw a story unfolding in the stars, a promise written across the sky. Some Ethiopian stories say that her writings contained not only sadness, but also prophecy. She could see far into the future, when the seed of redemption would walk the earth dressed in human weakness but carrying divine fire. There was one piece, softly translated from Gehazi by later scribes, that sounded like a sigh. I looked at the ground that drank our tears, and it glowed a little. The earth remembers kindness. We were not cast out of love, even though we were cast out of light. These words didn't come from anywhere else, but they felt old and heavy, like something a poet couldn't make up. Over the years, the stories spread across the world, from Nubia to Coptic monasteries, and into the hearts of Ethiopian mystics who thought Eve's scrolls had never really been lost. They said they stayed hidden in a spiritual form and could only be heard by people with humble hearts. They called them the lost scrolls of Eve because the world had forgotten how to listen, not because they were gone. When the mountains were covered in silver mist at night and the monasteries were quiet, monks would sometimes talk about strange dreams. They said that a woman dressed in light came to see them while they were sleeping. Her eyes were calm, and her hands were full of golden leaves that looked like flames. In a sad and soft voice, she would teach them prayers that were older than memory. When they awoke, they would find new understanding in the scriptures, as though the first mother herself had guided their hearts back to the origin of all things. A story tells of a monk named Abba Tesfa, who lived alone by Lake Tana. People said that one night during a big storm, he found a small bundle on the beach. It was linen wrapped tightly around fragile parchment. The letters glowed for a moment before fading into darkness when he opened it. He later said that the words were not meant to be read with the eyes, but with the heart. He then spent the rest of his life writing down prayers of thanks and repentance, saying they were echoes of Eve's last writings. The Mother Remembered is still written on a small chapel near that lake. Ethiopian culture also says that the first language, the one Adam and Eve spoke before they fell, never really went away. It was hidden in the songs of the faithful, like the hymns sung at dawn. People say that the hymns that come from the highlands and are carried by the wind to heaven bring back the same memory that Eve wrote in the ground. So when the monks chant in Ge'ez, they think they are continuing her prayer. They think that the lost scrolls live on in the melody of devotion, not on parchment. This belief is hauntingly beautiful, that the wisdom of the first woman lives on in living hearts, not in relics or relic keepers. Every time a mother sings to her child or a tired person kneels in the dark to ask for forgiveness, a page in her invisible book turns again. Her legacy is not limited to ink. It exists in every act of kindness that defies hopelessness. In one very old homily found in Ethiopian manuscripts, Eve's words are remembered as a whisper to all of her children. The world did not end when we fell. It started again with every breath we took in sadness and hope. People who have read this passage say it feels less like reading and more like the earth itself gently remembering you. There is a silence that only comes with reflection, the kind that comes when the world slows down enough for memory to breathe. The name Eve still echoes somewhere in the deep rhythm of human hearts. It's not a sign of failure. It's the quiet pulse of life itself. Her story is often told through the shaky lens of disobedience, but it also has a second hidden light, one of endurance, understanding, and the sacred wisdom that comes from pain. In her, the first woman, we see the start of sadness and the start of redemption. Her name, which has been passed down through generations, means life. It was not given by chance. People said it as a promise that life would go on, even in the dark, and that something divine would bloom again after loss. When she opened her eyes outside of Eden, the ground under her feet was no longer a paradise. It was rough, cold, and needed to be tamed, but she still found ways to care for others there, to put in the ground, to comfort, to learn. That was her real wisdom, not how to avoid falling, but how to get back up after it. Once she heard the voice that asked, "Did he really say that?" But after spending many years in the sun and rain, she learned to hear another voice inside her own soul. This voice was softer and quieter. It taught her that you learn by doing, and that divine love doesn't leave the fallen behind, it meets them in the dust. This is the part of her story that people forget. Eve's strength didn't come from being perfect, it came from being strong. She remembered paradise and made little gardens wherever she went. Every morning after her exile, she learned something new. The ground she was touching was holy, not because it was perfect, but because it had seen tears. Every pain, every loss, and every prayer said over broken ground turned into a talk with God. Eve learned something that few people had before during those long, tiring years. That wisdom doesn't come from knowing everything, but from accepting what can't be changed and still choosing to create, nurture, and hope. She learned humility by having to earn the things that used to be given to her. She saw her kids grow up, make choices, fall down, and get back up again. She saw parts of herself in them, some of which were stubborn, some of which were kind, and some of which were lost. But she still loved them all. This love was her gift to all people. It wasn't the perfect paradise, but the love of a mother who had been through both joy and sorrow. She learned a lot from her pain, and it made her wisdom shine even brighter. At times, in the quiet hours of the night, she would look up at the western sky where Eden used to shine. The sword that guarded its entrance glowed faintly beyond the horizon. It didn't hurt her to look anymore. She had learned that the real paradise was not behind her, but inside her, in her ability to keep loving even after losing someone. The angels may have closed the gate, but the Creator's heart was always open. Eve's story is a reflection of everyone who has ever made a mistake or felt the weight of regret. She reminds us that wisdom grows in the soil of mistakes, that no one is too far from grace to get back home. In her silence, her work, and her many years of prayer, she became the first teacher of what it means to live beyond the fall, to walk among thorns and still believe that flowers will come back. The old texts that have survived through the sands of time talk about her later years in a quiet way. They say that she taught her daughters how to weave, sing to the stars, and give thanks even when the harvest was small. She didn't talk about light as something to own, but as something to remember. When they asked her about Eden, she would smile a little and say, "Yes, it was beautiful." That was her gospel, that even outside the gates, the divine presence remains. Her wisdom wasn't written down or carved into stone. It went through eyes, through hands, and through the strength of women who kept going even when they didn't say anything. When she talked to the winds, she spoke for all the mothers who would come after her. They would cry, forgive, and start over. Her life became a living prophecy that one day redemption would walk the earth as a person, born from the same pain she had known. Eve lived again in every birth and every cry of new life. Her heart didn't stay in the dust. It beat in the generations that came after her. And even though people of 10 turned her story into a warning, the truth behind it is much softer and brighter. God's mercy doesn't go away after the fall. It gets stronger. It gets into the cracks of the human heart and grows there like a secret garden. The old Ethiopian traditions may call her the mother of all living because she became the model for loss, endurance, and rebirth, not because she was the first. Her wisdom is not a set of rules. It is a rhythm that guides the seasons, the tide, and the change of sorrow into song. We breathe the air she breathed out when we breathe. We say her prayer again when we forgive. In the quiet between the stars, there is a memory of her walking, not in shame, but in peace. Her hands, which used to shake, are now steady. Her eyes were full of tears before, but now they are calm and understanding. She now understands that every fall is part of a bigger rise and every exile is a step closer to home. And maybe that was the secret she kept all along. Love can never really die once it has been planted. It just learns how to grow in tougher soil. The old monks whispered about a woman whose story never died in the highlands of ancient Ethiopia, where clouds often rested on mountain peaks like silent witnesses. Her name was written not only in the first breath of scripture, but preserved in the folds of secret scrolls, in the Gedla Adam, in the Cave of Treasures, and in the ancient Book of Enoch. These writings weren't the loud, public proclamations of empires. They were quiet songs of remembrance that were passed down through generations of faith. And Eve, the first mother, came back to life in their faded ink. Her footsteps echoed not only through the sands of Eden, but also through the stone monasteries of Ethiopia, where her memory still lingered like incense in the air. Angels are said to have given the story of the Gedla Adam, or the conflict of Adam, and Eve, which was written down in Ge'ez, Ethiopia's holy language. It talks about both Adam's fight and Eve's tears, her strength while she was away from home, and her hope that never wavered. In its chapters, she was not the one who tempted people, but the one who comforted them. She was not the one who caused the fall, but the one who held humanity together when everything else fell apart. This text contained a truth that the Western world has forgotten, that sorrow gives birth to wisdom, and a woman's cry in the dark often marks the beginning of redemption. The Ethiopian monks said that Eve's journey was never meant to be a story of blame, but of healing. She was the first to kneel down and pray in their scrolls. Her voice shook through the cave as she begged for mercy, not just for herself, but for all her children. "Forgive them," she had said softly, "because they won't understand." The ground shook at her words. They said that heaven listened. And even though paradise was far away, God walked close by, unseen but there, turning her tears into rivers that would water future generations. When they got to her name, the people who were copying the old texts stopped. Some people dipped their pens twice before continuing, as if writing her name was a sacred act. They didn't see Eve as the shadow before dawn. They saw her as the dawn itself, fighting through the dark to bring light. The Cave of Treasures continued this story by telling how she protected the holy relics, gold, myrrh, and incense, the same gifts that would one day be given to the newborn Christ. She was the keeper of signs that would connect Eden and Bethlehem, the beginning and the end of the promise. The story slows down and the tone gets softer in the Cave of Treasures, as if even time itself bows. It talks about Eve's hands getting older, but still being gentle and working by the fire. They used the cave as a place to stay, pray, and remember both loss and love ever. By night, she would tend to the fire while Adam prayed next to her. They were both waiting for the day when heaven's light would once again touch the earth. The Ethiopian texts call this cave Ganazeze, which means hidden sanctuary. It was a place where the memory of paradise lived on, not in gold or stone, but in the heart of a woman. And then there was the Book of Enoch, which connected the two worlds. It told the story of angels who used to watch over people with amazement and how their gaze on Eve's children changed the course of heaven and earth. But there is something softer hidden in its lines, a hint of the first woman's influence that never went away. Enoch, Seth's great-grandson and her third son, carried on her legacy. They say he walked with God because Eve's early prayers had made heaven more willing to listen. The Book of Enoch doesn't remember her name. Instead, it remembers her by the themes of mercy, intercession, and divine forgiveness. Enoch's light turned Eve's sadness into a prophecy. Her tears, her strength, and her constant search for God became the example that the righteous would follow. The monks in Ethiopia said that her story wasn't lost at all. It had just changed shape and was now hidden in holy texts until the world was ready to hear it again. The first mother became more than a memory in these scrolls. She became a mystery, a reminder that heaven keeps track even when the world forgets. People who have read the old manuscripts say that the pages are heavy, but not because of the ink. They are heavy because they have been around for so long. The words move like prayers, and the rhythm of the translation flows like a heart beating steadily. The story of Eve unfolds slowly and with respect in each line, like a candle burning in a stone chapel. The scribes took their time. They knew that what they were keeping was not just history, but the very beginning of humanity, the breath that had once spoken to God. In the Gedla Adam, Eve's wisdom was kept safe by talking to angels in secret. They showed her how to pray and ask for God's mercy, even when it seemed far away. She was told about the coming Redeemer, who would come from her line and put an end to the serpent's lies for good. And so, even as she got older, her eyes were calm because she knew that the end of her story would not be despair. Her faith was the first seed of prophecy, and her silence was the soil of salvation. People in Ethiopia who think about her story don't see her as a fallen person. Instead, they see her as the first saint of suffering, the one who showed the world how to get back to God after getting lost. People sing hymns to her and call her Eme Hewet, which means Mother of Life. Her name is also used in the same breath as grace. The air in those old monasteries still echoes her voice, giving hope to those who have gone too far and softly assuring them that even the fallen are still loved. And so the books that are hidden hold her like a lullaby that needs to be remembered. Their verses aren't loud shouts. They're soft whispers that calm tired souls. As if the reader were walking barefoot on sacred ground, each word seems like it was meant to be read slowly by candlelight. Ethiopia's sacred memory of Eve tells a story of hope, not punishment. It tells us that the beginning wasn't ruined. It was just changed by grace. There are still monks who chant her story in a place deep in the mountains where mist curls around the old rock churches carved from red stone. They don't say her name with sadness. They say it with awe. They thought Eve was the first person to know how far away and how close God was. She was also the first person to cry and still believe that love would come back to earth in human form. Her story was never really lost. It just waited in the quiet folds of time until the world was as ready to see her not as the one who fell, but as the one who first believed that light could rise again. On the edge of the world, the morning that never ends was starting to wake up. There was no garden, no golden gate to walk through, and no snake whispering under the leaves. But there was light. It was the kind that doesn't hurt the eyes but stays in the soul, like the glow that stays after crying. They said that her name used to mean life, so it was fitting that the world's long story of sadness and redemption began with her. The rivers and mountains still seemed to remember her steps, the mother who had once walked with God and then learned to walk alone. A lot of people thought Eve's story was about destruction, but it wasn't. Her journey was the first mirror ever held up to people. It showed not only the reflection of failure, but also the reflection of choice, endurance, and the unbreakable thread of grace. From the moment she was born in Eden's trees to the moment she died in the fading light of earth, she carried something that no curse could break. It wasn't beauty, strength, or even knowledge that gave them hope, the kind that lasts through the flood, the fire, and the grave's silence. When the heavens shut their doors, she still talked to them. Her prayers, which came from the dust and the pain of losing paradise, became the first language of longing in the world. When her hands touched the ground, they blessed it with the promise of planting and growing. The rivers may have flowed from that same grief when she cried over her kids. But with each tear, she taught the world what it meant to start over. When Eve died, her breath became a whisper that traveled through time. It went through the tents of her sons and the songs of their kids. Enoch heard it in her dreams, and one day she would walk with the God she used to know. It made prophets and poets' hearts softer because they could still hear her spirit singing beneath their words. And even though empires would rise and fall, languages would change, and scrolls would fade, the story of the first mother never really went away. It just hid under the surface, waiting for the world to remember her not as the fallen, but as the forgiven. The Ethiopian texts that kept her memory alive, like the Cave of Treasures, the conflict of Adam and Eve, and the quiet corners of old monasteries, didn't blame her. They honored her. They thought of her as the one who held the secret of life's sadness and its never-ending rebirth. They wrote about how her tears turned into pearls and how her prayers became sweet smells on the altar of the ages. And in those holy pages, the fall wasn't the end. It was the start of the path to redemption. She had gained something that Eden could never give her, the knowledge of mercy. The story of Eve became the secret heartbeat of creation. Every mother who was pregnant with a child heard that same divine breath. Eve's legacy was played out over and over again in every act of forgiveness, every choice to love after pain, and every time she got back up after failing. People, as they walked through time, saw her reflection in their eyes. When we forgive, start over, and turn our faces back toward the quiet light of faith, we go back to that first promise made in the shadow of Eden, that even though the serpent would strike, a Redeemer would one day crush its head. Her silence now is very human. We don't see her name carved in stone or sung in victory. Instead, we hear her in the silence between prayers and the soft sigh of mourning after a long night. The mother of every dawn doesn't need a crown because the sunrise is her crown. It has never stopped since she first opened her eyes to it. And as the world turns under that sky, her story turns with it, a soft circle of forgiveness, an endless rhythm of fall and rise, death and life, sorrow and renewal. The angels didn't carry a sinner home. They carried a soul that had learned the most important truth about creation, that love lasts even when you're far away. Maybe they didn't sing about loss, but about coming back. The daughter coming back to the father who never stopped waiting for her. And somewhere outside of time, the garden bloomed again, not as a place, but as a promise kept. Now, when dawn breaks over the quiet fields of earth, it sounds like her voice is humming through the light, not in words, but in warmth, a mother's last blessing on her children who are still between heaven and dust. She whispers to every soul that feels far from grace and every heart that is heavy with its own story. You are not forgotten. You are still loved. The sky gets lighter, and her story slowly fades away in the wind. The trees sway as if they are remembering, and the ground breathes as if it is listening. In that stillness, which was the same stillness that filled Eden before the world began, the memory of Eve stays with me like the echo of a prayer. The first mother, the first dream of living, the first to fall, and the first to have hope. The light spreads out. The air gets softer. The sound of soft strings drifts through the air, like the last thought before sleep. Her voice is still there, not as a cry or a legend, but as a quiet promise. Every dawn since hers is a reminder that grace always comes back. And so, under the calm sky, the story ends, not with words, but with peace, as if heaven itself is singing a lullaby back into the heart of the world.